My son-in-law thought I was a harmless old man losing his mind. He forgot to ask what I did for 30 years before the farm. This is my story. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. My son-in-law shoved the brochure into my chest, hard enough that I took a step back. Not because it hurt, because I let him. There is a difference, and I want you to understand that from the beginning. The brochure was for Sycamore Ridge Memory Care and Assisted Living, a place off Interstate 40 in Brentwood, Tennessee, with a photograph of a smiling white-haired man on the cover who looked like he had never made a difficult decision in his life. Garrett Cole had been carrying it in the inside pocket of his jacket, which told me he had brought it to that parking lot on purpose. Men do not carry nursing home brochures by accident. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and the parking lot of the Vanderbilt University Medical Center Veterans Affairs Clinic smelled like exhaust and cut grass, and the particular kind of institutional sadness that clings to places where people go when they have run out of better options. I had been walking to my truck after a routine checkup, nothing wrong with me that time, and weather had not already done, when I heard Garrett's voice behind me. "Dad! Hey, Dad, wait up!" He never called me Dad unless Ryan was within earshot. I turned around. Ryan was there, my son, 31 years old, wearing the kind of business casual that Garrett had apparently decided was appropriate for both of them now. Ryan looked the way he had been looking for about 2 years, like a man trying very hard to appear comfortable in a life that did not quite fit him. Garrett walked 2 steps ahead of Ryan, the way he always did, occupying the front of every room and every conversation by default, as if the space around him existed primarily for his use. "Your father had another episode this morning," Garrett said to Ryan, though he was looking at me when he said it. He said it the way you'd report a minor malfunction in a household appliance. I had not had any episode. I had misplaced my truck keys for approximately 4 minutes before finding them in my jacket pocket, which is where I had put them. I was 71 years old. "I put things in my pockets," Garrett Ryan said quietly. "No." Garrett turned to my son with the practiced patience of a man who had learned exactly how much patience to display. "Ryan, we talked about this. Your father is declining. It happens. There's no shame in it, but we have to be realistic." I stood there in that parking lot, holding a paper bag with my prescription refills, and watched my son look at the ground. Ryan was a good man. He had always been a good man. But somewhere in the past 3 years, Garrett Cole had taught him to look at the ground whenever something needed to be said. Garrett held out the brochure. "Sycamore Ridge has an excellent reputation. The staff ratio is very good, and they have a veterans program." He said this last part as if it were a selling point designed specifically to appeal to me, as if 30 years of service could be adequately honored with a discount on a shared room in Brentwood. He pushed the brochure against my chest. I took it, not because I wanted it, because I was thinking. In 30 years of military intelligence work, I had learned that the most dangerous moment in any operation was not the moment of action. It was the moment before action, when the other side believed they had already won. Garrett Cole believed he had already won. I could see it in the way he was standing, weight forward on the balls of his feet, chin slightly elevated. The posture of a man delivering a verdict he considers final. I looked at him carefully, the way I used to look at men across a table, in rooms that did not officially exist, in conversations that were never recorded. There was something about the way Garrett held himself in the space between people. A habit of peripheral awareness, checking the edges of a scene while appearing to focus on the center. It was not the body language of arrogance, though arrogance was certainly present. It was something older than arrogance. It was the posture of a man who had learned at some point in his life to always know where the exits were. I had seen that posture before. I just could not remember where. Ryan Garrett continued, his voice dropping into what I had come to think of as his reasonable tone. The tone he used when he wanted Ryan to feel that disagreement was a form of irrationality. The cognitive decline is gradual, That's actually the difficult part. It seems manageable until it isn't. Dad. Ryan finally looked up at me. His eyes said he was sorry. His mouth said nothing. I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about saying a number of things. I had a prescription bag in one hand and a brochure for a memory care facility in the other. And my son was standing 3 feet away from me, unable to find a single word in my defense. I folded the brochure in half and put it in my jacket pocket. I'll look it over, I said. Garrett's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A brief recalibration. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for resistance. My compliance had disrupted the scene he had rehearsed. That was fine. I wanted him disrupted. I said goodbye to Ryan, who hugged me with the careful gentleness of a man who was already grieving something he hadn't lost yet. I walked to my truck, unlocked it, placed the prescription bag on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. In the rearview mirror, I watched Garrett put his hand on Ryan's shoulder and steer him toward their car. Garrett was talking. Ryan was nodding. It was the same motion I had watched for 3 years, the steering and the nodding. I started the engine. That posture, that peripheral awareness, the way Garrett's eyes had moved across the parking lot without appearing to move at all. I had seen it before. I was certain of it now. The question was where. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove south toward home, toward the 40 acres outside of Nashville that I had owned for 26 years. Toward the room in the back of the house that I kept locked, where I kept the things I had never shown my son, where I kept the files. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the farm, I had a feeling in my chest that I had not felt in 8 years. The particular cold clarity that arrives when a pattern begins to resolve itself from noise. When something that seemed random reveals its shape. I had felt it in Kabul in 2003. I had felt it in a basement in Juarez in 2009. I had felt it sitting across from men who thought they were the most dangerous person in the room. I felt it now, driving home on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with a brochure for a memory care facility in my jacket pocket. Garrett Cole had made a mistake that afternoon. Not the brochure, not the words. The mistake was simpler than that, and more permanent. He had let me look at him. The farm looked the same as it always did at dusk, which was one of the things I valued most about it. 40 acres of Middle Tennessee that did not care what kind of day you had. The tree line to the west went dark early this time of year, and by the time I parked the truck and walked to the porch, the sky had turned the color of cold iron. I went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while, without turning on the lights. Ryan did not know what I had done for 30 years. That was not an accident. It was the most deliberate decision of my life, more deliberate than any operational choice I had made in the field. And I had made choices in the field that changed the course of things in ways that will never appear in any public record. His mother knew. Eleanor had known from the beginning, because I had told her before we married, sitting in a booth at a diner in Clarksville, Tennessee in 1988. I told her I worked in military intelligence, and that I could not tell her much beyond that. And she had looked at me for a long moment and said, "I figured it was something like that." Then she ordered pie. That was Eleanor. She had a gift for accepting the shape of things without needing to change them. She died when Ryan was 9 years old. Pancreatic cancer 4 months from diagnosis to the end. Fast and merciless the way certain things are. The night after the funeral, I sat in Ryan's room while he slept, and I made a decision. Ryan was going to grow up without his mother. That was already decided, already done, a wound that would never fully close. What I could control was this. He was not also going to grow up carrying the weight of what his father did. He was not going to spend his childhood afraid, wondering where I was, whether I was coming home, what the locked room at the end of the hall contained. He was not going to be the intelligence officer's son, before he was simply Ryan. So I became invisible. At work, I was Colonel Earl Maddox, 30 years of operations across 4 continents, a man whose name appeared in classified documents that most generals never read. At home, I was a father who worked for the government in some vague administrative capacity and did not talk about it much. When I retired 8 years ago, I told Ryan I had been in military logistics. He had no reason to question it. I had been very careful to give him no reason. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon and took it to the back of the house. The locked room was the second door on the right. I had not opened it in 14 months. The key lived on a ring with 3 others in the left front pocket of my work jeans, and I had carried it every day for 8 years, the way some men carry a photograph of someone they have lost. Not because I needed it, because forgetting felt like a different kind of loss. The lock turned the way it always did, with a precision that reminded me of the man who had installed it, a former Army engineer named Bridges, who did not ask questions and built things to last. Inside the room smelled of old paper and gun oil, and the particular closed-air staleness of a space that had been sealed from the world. 4 filing cabinets along the left wall, gray metal, each one labeled by year in black marker. Shelves on the right, holding binders, hard drives in anti-static cases, 2 locked steel boxes whose contents I had not looked at in years. A single desk in the center with a lamp and a magnifying glass, and the kind of wooden chair that offers no comfort and requires none. I sat down and turned on the lamp. I had been thinking about Garrett's posture since the parking lot. The peripheral scanning, the weight distribution. In 30 years of intelligence work, you develop a catalog of human behavior patterns the way a mechanic develops a catalog of engine sounds. You learn to identify what you are hearing before you can name it. The sound was familiar. I just needed to find where I had heard it before. I started with the 2017 files. That year, I had been 18 months into retirement, consulting part-time for a joint task force targeting organized crime networks operating across the Mid-South. Tennessee, Kentucky, northern Mississippi. Networks that moved money through legitimate business fronts. The kind of operation that requires lawyers who understand how to construct distance between criminal activity and its financial benefits. I pulled the 2017 cabinet open and lifted out the first 3 folders. It took me 40 minutes to find it. The file was labeled Cole Legal Group, Associated Contacts, and it was thinner than I remembered, which meant I had been working from the assumption that the lead was thinner than it turned out to be. Garrett Cole had appeared in the task force files as a peripheral figure, a criminal defense attorney who represented several individuals connected to a money movement network operating out of Memphis. Not a target himself. A professional contact of targets. The kind of lawyer who is either very good at staying clean or very good at appearing to be clean. And in my experience, those 2 things are often the same thing. I turned to page 47. There was a surveillance photograph, black and white, slightly grainy, in the way of photographs taken from distance with long lenses. 2 men standing outside a restaurant in Memphis. One of them was a man named Duvall, who was currently serving 11 years in a federal facility in Kentucky. The other man was younger, early 30s, in a good suit, standing with his weight forward on the balls of his feet. I held the photograph under the lamp. The posture was exact. The peripheral awareness was exact. The slight elevation of the chin, the way the shoulders carried themselves. The careful management of how much space to occupy. I set the photograph down on the desk and sat back in my chair. The room was very quiet. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the tree line, and somewhere distant, a dog. Normal sounds. The sounds of a farm in October in Tennessee. My son had been married for 3 years to a man who had been in my files for 8. I sat with that for a long time. The lamp threw a small circle of light across the desk, and outside that circle, everything was dark. And I let the dark be dark, while I thought through what I knew and what I did not know, and what the distance was between those two things. Garrett Cole had been a peripheral figure in 2017. Peripheral did not mean innocent. It meant the evidence had not yet been sufficient. It meant the task force had moved on to more accessible targets and left the edges of the network for another day. Another day had apparently arrived. I looked at the photograph again. The man in the good suit outside the restaurant in Memphis. Younger then, but the same posture, the same management of space, the same eyes that were always measuring something. The same man who had stood in a VA parking lot 4 hours ago and pushed a brochure for a memory care facility into my chest. I opened the next folder and began to read. I read for 3 hours without stopping. The coffee went cold on the desk beside me. Outside, the wind picked up, and I could hear it working its way through the gaps in the barn siding, a sound I had listened to for 26 years without ever finding it unpleasant. That night, I did not hear it at all. I was somewhere else entirely. I was back in 2017, sitting in a task force briefing room in Nashville, looking at a board covered in names and photographs and the red string that investigators use to show connection, which always struck me as optimistic. Red string implies the connections are visible. Most of the time they are not. The Cole Legal Group file was thinner than the primary target files, but thickness is not the same as significance. Sometimes the thinnest file in the room is the most important one, because it means someone was very careful. Garrett Cole had been very careful. His name appeared 11 times in the 2017 documentation. 4 times as attorney of record for individuals connected to the network. 3 times in surveillance logs as a contact of contacts, men who knew men who moved money. Twice in financial cross-references, payments from shell accounts to his firm's operating account that could be explained as legal fees, and probably were, in the same way that a gun can technically be explained as a paperweight. Once in a wiretap transcript, a conversation between 2 network members in which his name was mentioned briefly and then not mentioned again, which, in my experience, means the people speaking had been trained not to mention it. And once on page 47, in a surveillance photograph outside a restaurant in Memphis. I had noted him in 2017 as a person of interest who warranted monitoring. The task force had disagreed. Resources were finite. Primary targets were accessible. And a peripheral legal contact with no direct evidence of criminal activity was not where the money and the manpower needed to go. I had filed my assessment. The task force had moved on, and Garrett Cole had remained on the edge of a file that was eventually closed when Duvall and 3 others were convicted and sentenced. I had always believed there were people in that network who had not been found. I pulled out the wiretap transcript and read it again under the lamp. The exchange was brief. 2 men talking about a meeting that needed to happen, through the right channels. One of them said, "Use the lawyer, he knows how to structure it." The other said, "He's careful," which was said as a compliment. The conversation moved on. Use the lawyer. He knows how to structure it. I set the transcript down and picked up the photograph from page 47 again. Garrett in Memphis, 2017, standing outside a restaurant with Duvall. Garrett would have been 29 years old in that photograph. 3 years out of law school, building a practice in Nashville. Already careful, already knowing how to structure things. I thought about the parking lot that afternoon. I thought about Garrett's voice, the reasonable tone, the practiced patience. And then I thought about something specific he had said, something I had registered at the time without knowing why it registered. He had used a particular phrase when he was talking to Ryan about me. He had said, "The cognitive decline is gradual. That's actually the difficult part. It seems manageable until it isn't." It was a clinical phrase, precise, the kind of language that appears in legal documents related to guardianship proceedings. Not the kind of phrase a man uses casually about his father-in-law's misplaced keys, unless he has been reading guardianship statutes. I opened the second cabinet and pulled the 2019 files. It took me 20 minutes to find what I was looking for. A follow-up assessment I had written during a brief consulting engagement after my primary retirement. A note about financial patterns in Tennessee that suggested the network Duvall had been part of had not dissolved after his conviction, only reorganized. Networks do not dissolve. They adapt. They find new structures and new people who know how to structure things. The assessment identified 3 possible continuation nodes. 1 had been investigated and cleared. 1 had moved out of state. The 3rd was listed as unresolved. A legal and financial infrastructure in Nashville that showed the right patterns, but lacked the direct evidence needed to act. I read the description of the Nashville node carefully. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling of the locked room for a long moment. The Nashville node in the 2019 assessment was not identified by name. It was identified by pattern, by the way money moved, by the type of legal structures used, by the geographic footprint, by the client profile. I had not been able to put a name to it in 2019 because I had not had enough information. I had more information now. I had spent an afternoon in a parking lot with a man who carried nursing home brochures in his inside jacket pocket and used guardianship language casually, and had the peripheral awareness of someone who had learned to survive in rooms where trust was a liability. I had spent 3 hours reading files I had not opened in 8 years. I had a surveillance photograph of that same man standing outside a restaurant in Memphis with a convicted criminal. The pattern matched. It matched the way fingerprints match, not approximately, not probably, but with the particular certainty that comes from 30 years of knowing what you are looking at. Garrett Cole was not a peripheral figure who had stayed clean. Garrett Cole was the part of the network that had never been found, the part that had reorganized after 2017 and built something new and apparently quite successful. New enough and successful enough to afford a house in a good neighborhood and a marriage into a family that he had apparently selected in part because the father was a retired old man on a farm who nobody would believe if he started making accusations. I looked at the photograph one more time. The young man in the good suit, standing with his weight forward, knowing where the exits were. My son had married the man I had failed to catch in 2017, and Garrett Cole had been living 3 years inside my family, without ever knowing that the old man on the farm, the one he was planning to put in a memory care facility in Brentwood, had spent 30 years hunting men exactly like him. I turned off the lamp. The room went dark, and I sat in the dark for a while, letting the full weight of it settle. Not the anger, though the anger was present. Not the fear, though I understood clearly what was at stake. Something older than either of those things. The cold, clear recognition of a problem that needed to be solved. And the equally clear recognition that I was, despite 8 years of retirement and a Tuesday afternoon in a VA parking lot, still very much capable of solving it. I got up, locked the room behind me, and went to the kitchen to make fresh coffee. I had phone calls to make in the morning. I was at the kitchen table at 5:45 in the morning with fresh coffee and the 2 relevant files from the locked room when I picked up my phone and dialed Pete Dawson's number. Pete answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring. First ring was too eager. Third ring was too slow. Pete had opinions about things like that. Small disciplines that added up to the kind of man you wanted in the room when the room got complicated. "Earl," he said. Not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement. Like he had been expecting the call and was confirming that it had arrived. "I need to meet," I said. "Today. This morning." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Give me 2 hours," he said. "My office." Pete Dawson was 63 years old and had spent 22 of those years working alongside me in various configurations of military and federal intelligence work, The kind that gets described in briefings as interagency cooperation and feels in practice like 6 people who trust each other completely, trying to do the work of 60 people they cannot fully trust at all. He had retired 4 years before I did and opened a private investigations firm in Nashville that did corporate due diligence and fraud investigation and the occasional domestic case that he took because the money was straightforward, even if the work was not. His office was on the 4th floor of a building on 2nd Avenue North. 3 rooms with good sight lines to the street below, which I knew was not an accident. Pete had chosen the office the way he chose everything, with specific criteria that he did not necessarily articulate, but that were always present. I laid the relevant files on his desk without preamble. He read for 20 minutes while I drank the coffee his assistant had brought, without being asked, which told me Pete had told her I was coming, which told me Pete had been expecting this call longer than this morning. When he finished, he aligned the files into a neat stack and set them to one side. "Garrett Cole," he said. "You know the name." It was not a question. Pete looked at me with the expression he used when he was deciding how much of what he knew to say first. "I ran a background on him 14 months ago," Pete said. "Standard due diligence. A client of mine was considering a business arrangement with someone in Cole's network and wanted to know who they were dealing with." "What did you find?" Pete leaned back in his chair. "Clean surface. Good reputation in the Nashville legal community defense attorney with a solid win rate. No disciplinary actions, no criminal record. But the financials on his firm were interesting." "Interesting how?" "The operating revenue doesn't match the client load. He's billing for the hours of a mid-size practice, but the overhead structure suggests something considerably larger." Pete paused. "Either he has clients who are paying significantly above market rate for routine legal services, or the legal services are not the primary product." I told him what I had found in the files. The 2017 surveillance, the photograph with Duvall, the wiretap transcript about using the lawyer who knew how to structure things, the 2019 assessment of the Nashville node. I told him about the parking lot the previous afternoon, the brochure, the guardianship language. Pete listened without interrupting. This was one of his best qualities. He understood that interrupting a man who is giving you information is a way of telling him that your reaction matters more than his facts, and Pete did not believe that. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's been planning the guardianship for a while," Pete said. "That kind of language doesn't come from casual observation. He's been reading the statutes, probably consulted with someone who specializes in elder law. He knows what he needs to establish to make a petition viable." "What does he need?" "Pattern of cognitive decline documented over time. Preferably by medical professionals, but in the early stages, family testimony carries weight." He paused. "How long has he been telling Ryan you're declining?" I thought about the past 2 years. The small comments I had noticed and filed away without fully understanding what they were building toward. The way Garrett would reference my age in conversations as a gentle qualifier. Your father's memory isn't what it was. Your father gets confused sometimes. Individual comments that seemed like concern and together formed something that was not concern at all. 2 years at least, I said. Pete nodded slowly. He's been constructing a record, building a case the way a lawyer builds a case, piece by piece, witness by witness. By the time he files a petition, he'll have Ryan and probably a doctor or 2, whether those doctors are legitimate or not. Can he get fraudulent medical documentation? He can get whatever he needs if he has the right connections. Pete looked at me steadily. And based on what you've told me about his network, he has the right connections. I drank my coffee. Outside Pete's window, 2nd Avenue was beginning to fill with morning traffic. Normal people going to normal jobs. The ordinary machinery of a city running on schedule. There's something else, Pete said. I waited. My client from 14 months ago. The one who wanted due diligence on Cole's network. The business arrangement they were considering fell through. but I kept a passive monitoring flag on the associated financial accounts. Standard practice. Costs me nothing. Occasionally useful. He opened his desk drawer and took out a folder I had not seen him prepare, which meant he had prepared it before I arrived, which meant he had been doing more than expecting my call. 3 weeks ago, one of those flagged accounts showed unusual activity. A large transfer routed through 2 intermediary accounts before landing in an offshore structure. Pete opened the folder and turned it to face me. The amount was significant. The timing was specific. And the destination account is registered to a holding company whose sole listed asset is a property in Costa Rica. I looked at the document. I looked at the amount. I looked at the name of the holding company. The name of Garrett Cole's current primary client, the man whose case he was actively litigating in Nashville criminal court, was printed at the top of the transfer authorization. I knew that name. I knew it the way you know a name that has lived in a file for years, that has appeared in assessments and briefings, and the kind of conversations that happen in rooms without windows. It was a name connected to what remained of the network that Duval had anchored, the part that had kept operating after 2017, the part I had described in my 2019 assessment as unresolved. The name was Harlan Cross. Pete watched me read. He gave me the time I needed. Garrett Cole is not just laundering money through his legal practice, I said. He's actively representing the man at the center of what's left of the network. Pete nodded. And if Cross is moving money offshore in that volume, he said, it means something is changing. Either the operation is concluding, or someone is preparing to leave. I set the document down. A lawyer who is embedded in a criminal network does not stay embedded forever. At some point, the network moves, or dissolves, or gets found. And when that happens, the lawyer either goes with it or gets left behind to absorb whatever comes next. Either way, the window for everything Garrett Cole had been building, the legal practice, the marriage, the guardianship plan, the property he intended to acquire and liquidate, that window was not indefinitely open. How long, I said. Pete looked at me. Based on the transfer pattern and the offshore structure. Yes. He considered it. 3 months, maybe 4. After that, whatever he's planning to do, he'll have done it. I stood up and walked to Pete's window and looked at 2nd Avenue below. The morning was fully arrived now, bright and cold. The kind of October day that looks warmer than it is. 3 months was enough time, if I moved correctly. 3 months was nothing, if I moved wrong. I turned back to Pete. I need your help, I said. All of it. Pete Dawson smiled for the first time that morning. It was a small smile, the kind that means a man has been waiting to hear something and is relieved it has finally been said. Earl, he said, I've had this office for 4 years, and I have been mildly bored for approximately 3.5 of them. Tell me what you need. Ryan's truck appeared at the end of the gravel road at 6:47 on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the parking lot. I was on the porch with coffee, watching the last of the light leave the tree line when I heard the engine. I recognized it before I saw the headlights. A man who raised a son on a farm learns the sound of his truck the way he learns the sound of the house at night, as something that belongs to the landscape. I had not told Ryan I was watching his father-in-law. I had not told him anything. The investigation Pete and I had begun was 11 days old and consisted so far of financial surveillance, 2 conversations with Danny Reeves, a former FBI financial crimes analyst who owed Pete a significant favor and had agreed to consult, and a careful review of every document I could access through legitimate channels. It was not yet enough. It was beginning to be something. Ryan parked beside the barn and walked to the porch, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the particular gait of a man who has been sitting in a car thinking about something for longer than the drive required. Hey, Dad. Hey. I stood and opened the door. You eat. Not yet. That was all we needed. I went to the kitchen, and he sat at the table, the same chair he had sat in since he was old enough to sit in chairs. And I made the kind of dinner that required no discussion. Pork chops, green beans from the garden I had put up in August, cornbread from a cast-iron skillet, the food my mother had made and that I had learned to make for Ryan after Eleanor died. The grammar of our family expressed in a specific vocabulary of cast iron and mason jars. We ate without much conversation for a while. Ryan ate the way he had eaten since he was a boy, efficiently and without complaint, which I had always taken as a form of respect. He had never been a difficult child at the table. He had never been a difficult child anywhere, which sometimes made me wonder if I had made things too easy for him, and sometimes made me think I had simply been fortunate. "How's the practice?" I asked. Ryan was a physical therapist, with his own small clinic in Brentwood, 3 staff members, and a patient load he had built steadily over 6 years. He was good at it. He had Eleanor's patience with people, and my attention to how things worked mechanically. "Good," Ryan said. "Busy." He broke off a piece of cornbread. "We picked up 3 new referral sources this quarter." "That's good." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Garrett's been helping with the business side, the contracts, the vendor agreements. He said it makes sense to have legal eyes on everything while we're growing." I refilled my coffee. I said nothing. "He renegotiated our equipment lease last month," Ryan continued. "Saved us about $800 a month." He looked up at me briefly, then back at his plate. "He's good at that stuff, the financial structuring." I noted the phrase, financial structuring. It was Garrett's language, not Ryan's. Ryan talked about money in plain terms, what things cost and what they were worth. Financial structuring was the vocabulary of a man who wanted other people to think of him as someone who understood instruments they did not. We finished dinner. I cleared the plates and Ryan stayed at the table with his water glass, turning it slowly in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking about how to say something. "Dad," he said, finally. I waited. "Garrett thinks we should look at bringing an investor into the practice. A silent partner, basically. Provide capital for expansion, we'd give up a percentage of equity. He's got a client who's interested." I set the dishes in the sink and turned around. Ryan was looking at me with the expression of a man who has been told something that sounds reasonable and cannot entirely identify why it doesn't feel reasonable. It was an expression I recognized. I had seen it in briefing rooms on the faces of people who were being told a story that was internally consistent but externally wrong. "What kind of investor?" I asked. "A holding company. Garrett says they do this kind of thing regularly, invest in small healthcare businesses. It's a standard structure." "Who owns the holding company?" Ryan blinked. "I don't know. Garrett's handling the paperwork." I turned back to the sink and finished the dishes. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that a lawyer who offers to bring an investor to his spouse's small business and then handles all the paperwork himself without disclosing who the investor is not providing legal services. He is providing something else entirely. I dried my hands and came back to the table. Ryan was reaching into his jacket pocket for his phone, and as he did, something slipped out. A folded document, white paper, the kind of legal weight paper that lawyers use for agreements intended to appear substantial. It fell to the floor beside his chair, and he reached for it quickly, the way you reach for something you were not intending to show. I picked it up before he did. Not aggressively, just the natural motion of a man who is closer to the floor than he used to be and bends down without thinking about it. I looked at it for 2 seconds before handing it back. That was enough. It was the first page of what appeared to be an investment agreement. The investor was listed as Apex Holdings, LLC. The signatory on behalf of Ryan's practice was Ryan Maddox, signed in Ryan's handwriting, a signature I would have recognized anywhere. I had watched him develop it from the wobbly printing of a 7-year-old to the distinctive, forward-leaning script he used as an adult. The document was dated 6 weeks ago. Ryan took it from me and folded it back into his pocket without meeting my eyes. Garrett had it drawn up already, Ryan said. It's not finalized yet. There are still some details. I looked at my son, 31 years old, sitting at the kitchen table where he had eaten 10,000 meals, turning his water glass in his hands, telling me about a document he had already signed 6 weeks ago for an investor whose identity he did not know, for a deal that his attorney's spouse had structured and prepared and presented to him as a routine matter. That sounds like something worth reviewing carefully, I said, before anything is finalized. Yeah, Ryan said. He put his phone away. Garrett says it's pretty standard. I nodded. After a moment, I said, "You want pie?" Ryan looked up, and for a second, he looked exactly the way he had looked at 9 years old, sitting at this same table 2 weeks after his mother died, when he had asked me if things were going to be okay, and I had told him yes, because I believed it, and because he needed to hear it. Yeah, he said, pie sounds good. I cut 2 slices and brought them to the table, and we ate them without talking about Garrett, or the investment agreement, or Apex Holdings, LLC. We talked about Ryan's patience, about a hunting dog his neighbor was trying to sell him, about whether the barn roof was going to need replacing before spring. When he left an hour later, standing at his truck in the dark with the engine running, he hugged me the same way he had hugged me in the parking lot. Careful and slightly apologetic. Like he was grieving something he hadn't lost yet, or like he was carrying something heavy that he didn't know how to put down. I watched his taillights disappear down the gravel road. Apex Holdings, LLC. An investment agreement signed 6 weeks ago by my son for an unknown investor, structured by his lawyer spouse in a deal Ryan had not mentioned until a document fell out of his pocket by accident. My son was already inside the trap. He just did not know it yet. I went back inside and called Pete. The phone rang at 5:12 in the morning, and I was already awake. I had been awake since 3, lying in the dark, with the specific wakefulness that is not restlessness, but calculation. The mind running through variables while the body stays still. 30 years of early mornings had given me a relationship with pre-dawn hours that most people do not have. The dark before 5 in the morning is a different quality of dark. It has weight and clarity at the same time. And I had done some of my best thinking in it. Pete, I said. Get dressed, he said. Danny's already here. Pete's office on 2nd Avenue looked different at 6 in the morning than it did at 9. The city outside the windows was still assembling itself. Delivery trucks and early commuters, and the particular quiet of a place that is not yet decided to be loud. Danny Reeves was sitting in the chair across from Pete's desk with a paper coffee cup and the expression of a man who has been awake long enough that tiredness has passed through him and come out the other side as a kind of sharp, flat focus. Danny Reeves was 58 years old and had spent 19 years in the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, before a disagreement with his supervisor over methodology, which was Danny's way of saying he had been right about something important, and his supervisor had not wanted to hear it, and he had retired rather than continue the conversation. He was precise in the way of men who have spent their careers reading financial documents, which is to say, he was precise about everything, including the way he arranged papers on a desk, and the order in which he presented information. He had 3 folders in front of him, arranged in a specific sequence. I sat down, and Pete poured coffee without asking. Apex Holdings, LLC, Danny said, opening the first folder. Registered in Delaware 18 months ago. Single member LLC. Managing member listed as a trust. The trust registered in Nevada under a name that traces back to a second trust registered in Wyoming. He turned the folder toward me. It took me 4 days to get through the layering. At the end of it, the beneficial owner of Apex Holdings is Garrett Cole. I looked at the registration documents. The layering was elegant. 3 jurisdictions, 2 trust structures, a registered agent in each state who appeared on dozens of similar filings and would not remember this one. It was the kind of structure a lawyer builds when he knows exactly what questions investigators ask and has designed the answers in advance. Apex Holdings has been receiving payments, Danny continued. He opened the second folder. Payments that correspond in timing and approximate amount to invoices sent from Ryan Maddox's physical therapy practice to various insurance companies and private pay clients. He laid out a series of transaction records side by side. The payment arrives in the practice account. A portion is transferred to Apex Holdings within 48 hours. Described in the books as a management consulting fee. How much, I asked. Danny looked at me steadily. Over 18 months, approximately $240,000. He paused to let that number settle. Your son's practice generated that revenue through legitimate patient care. Garrett structured the books so that a percentage of every payment cycle routes through Apex before returning, minus his cut, to the operating account. Ryan's financial statements show the consulting fees as a legitimate business expense. He has no reason to question it because Garrett handles the books and Ryan trusts him to handle the books. I set my coffee cup down. Ryan doesn't know, Pete said. We're confident of that. The structure is specifically designed so that the person whose name is on the practice sees clean numbers. The theft is invisible from where Ryan sits. I looked at the transaction records. 18 months of payments, dozens of transactions. Each one small enough to seem routine. Each one building toward a total that was not routine at all. $240,000 taken from my son's practice, from the work of his hands and his staff's hands, and 6 years of building something legitimate and good, routed through a shell structure designed by the man Ryan had married and trusted with everything. Danny opened the third folder. This is where it becomes urgent, he said. I looked at him. 3 weeks ago, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Nashville opened a preliminary inquiry into Apex Holdings, LLC. He turned the folder toward me. The trigger was a suspicious activity report filed by a bank that noticed the pattern of transfers. The inquiry is in early stages. No subpoenas yet, no formal targets. But the initial scope document lists 2 names for further investigation. He pointed to the first name on the document. Garrett Cole, I said. Danny nodded. And the second name, I read it. I read it again. Ryan Maddox. The room was very quiet. Outside, a truck was moving down 2nd Avenue, its engine a low, steady note that faded as it went. Pete was looking at his coffee cup. Danny was looking at me with the careful attention of a man delivering a diagnosis he wishes he did not have to give. Ryan is listed as a co-investigative subject, Danny said. At this stage, it means nothing definitive. His name appears on the Apex adjacent accounts because his practice is the payment source. The FBI doesn't know yet whether he's a victim or a participant. That determination comes later, when the inquiry deepens. How long before it deepens, I asked. Danny considered. 6 to 8 weeks before they start issuing document requests. Maybe 10 if they're understaffed, which they usually are. After the document requests go out, Ryan will know he's under investigation. His bank will notify him. His accountant will notify him. He'll get a letter. And Garrett. Pete answered that one. Garrett will know before Ryan does. He has contacts in the legal community who monitor these things. Lawyers who represent clients in federal inquiries develop early warning systems. If an inquiry touches anything near Garrett's network, he'll hear about it within days. Which means, I said slowly, that when Garrett hears the FBI has opened an inquiry into Apex Holdings, he will know his timeline has changed. Pete nodded. He won't have 3 or 4 months anymore. He'll move everything he can move as fast as he can move it, and then he'll find a way to make sure that when the document requests arrive, the name on the accounts that matters is not Garrett Cole.
It's Ryan, I said.
Danny closed the third folder. Garrett has been building a cage around your son for 18 months, bar by bar, signature by signature. By the time the FBI formally identifies a target in this inquiry, the cage will be complete. Ryan's name will be on the accounts. Ryan's signature will be on the agreements. Ryan's practice will be the documented payment source. I stood up and walked to Pete's window. 2nd Avenue below was filling with mourning. People with coffee cups, a woman walking a large dog, a delivery truck idling at the corner. Normal things. The surface of a city that did not know what was happening in the rooms above it. Garrett hadn't just been building a path to my property and my son's money. He had been building a cell with Ryan's name on the door. A place to put the consequences of his crimes when the time came to need somewhere to put them.
How much time do we have, I asked,
before the inquiry deepens enough to matter?
Danny and Pete exchanged the look that men exchange when the answer to a question is shorter than the person asking it would like.
6 weeks, Danny said. If we're lucky, 8. I turned from the window.
6 weeks was enough if I moved correctly.
6 weeks was nothing if I moved wrong. And the difference between those two outcomes was sitting in this room at 6 in the morning with 2 men who had been awake since before dawn, because I had called them and they had come.
What do you need from us? Pete asked.
Everything I said. I need everything you have, and I need it fast.
I went back to the locked room that night, not for the files this time.
I had read enough files. I knew what the files contained and what they meant and what needed to happen next. I went back because there are questions that files cannot answer, and I had been carrying one of those questions for 30 years, and it had gotten heavier recently in a way that I needed to sit with before I could move forward.
I turned on the lamp and sat in the wooden chair and looked at the shelves.
The locked room contained the evidence of a life. 30 years of work that I had sealed away when I retired, the way you seal away a part of yourself when the time for that part has passed. The filing cabinets with their black marker labels. The hard drives in their anti-static cases. The 2 locked steel boxes that held things I hoped Ryan would never need to know about, and that I would explain to him someday if I decided the knowing would help him more than the not knowing.
On the top shelf in a gray metal box that was not locked
were the things I had kept for different reasons. Not evidence, not operational records. Personal things that had no place in the filing cabinets, but that I had not been able to leave behind when I packed the rest of my professional life away.
My service medals in their presentation cases.
A photograph of my unit taken in 2001 that I could not look at for very long because 3 of the men in it were dead, and one of them had died in a way that I had spent years trying to stop thinking about in the middle of the night.
And at the back of the box, in a white envelope that had yellowed at the edges, a letter in Eleanor's handwriting.
She had written it 6 weeks before she died, in the period when she was still clear enough to write, but tired enough that every word cost her something. I had found it in her bedside drawer 3 days after the funeral, addressed to me in her careful schoolteacher's cursive, the E in Earl looping the way it always had.
I took the envelope from the box and held it for a moment without opening it.
I had read it perhaps 30 times over the years, which meant I knew it well enough that reading it again was less about the words and more about the act of returning to her voice.
I opened it. The letter was 3 pages, written on the yellow legal pad paper she used for everything.
She talked about Ryan, about the things she hoped for him, about the particular combination of stubbornness and gentleness that she said he had gotten from me, though I had always thought the gentleness was entirely hers. She talked about the farm and about the apple tree she had planted the spring before she got sick, which was still alive and still producing, a fact that felt important in a way I had never been able to entirely explain.
Near the end of the 2nd page, she wrote the thing I had been thinking about since the parking lot.
I know you, Earl. I know why you've kept the work separate from the home, and I understand it, and I don't think you were wrong. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. The way you think about things when nobody is watching. Are you protecting Ryan from the weight of what you do? Or are you protecting yourself from the weight of letting him fully know you? I think it might be both. I think it started as one and became the other without you noticing. And I think someday, when Ryan is older and the world has shown him a few things, he will be ready to know his father. All of his father. Not just the part that drives him to school and makes dinner and fixes the fence. Promise me you'll find that moment. Promise me you'll let him know you before it's too late for it to matter. I folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. Eleanor had been right, as she had been right about most things that mattered. I had started keeping the work separate because I believed it was the right way to protect Ryan. I had continued keeping it separate because the separation had become its own kind of protection, not for Ryan, but for me. If Ryan did not know what I had done, he could not judge it. He could not look at me with the particular look that men sometimes gave me when they learned what decisions I had been responsible for. The look that contained both respect and a kind of distance, as if they were recalibrating how close they wanted to stand. I had been afraid of that look from my own son. I sat with that for a while. The lamp threw its small circle of light, and outside the circle the room was dark, and I let the dark be dark. Then I thought about Ryan at the kitchen table 11 days ago, turning his water glass in his hands. The careful way he had said, "Garrett's handling the books." The way he had reached for the fallen document quickly, reflexively, not wanting me to see it. Ryan was 31 years old. He had built a legitimate business through 6 years of genuine work. He was not a stupid man. He had Eleanor's perceptiveness and my patience, and those two things together produce a person who notices more than they appear to notice. Had he noticed something? I thought about his eyes when he talked about Garrett's financial structuring. There had been something in them, not quite pride and not quite comfort. Something more like the expression of a man reciting a position he has decided to hold, even though the position does not entirely fit him. The expression of someone who has made a choice to trust and is working to sustain that choice against the friction of small doubts. Small doubts meant something had generated them. I thought about the question Ryan had asked at the end of dinner, almost as an afterthought, standing at the kitchen door with his jacket half on. "Dad," he had said, "do you think people can change? Like, fundamentally. Can someone be one way for a long time and then decide to be different and actually do it?" I had said I thought it depended on what you meant by change and what the person wanted to change toward. Ryan had nodded and looked like he wanted to say more, and then didn't, and went to his truck. I had filed the question away because I was thinking about Apex Holdings LLC, and I had not given it the attention it deserved. I gave it attention now. That was not an abstract philosophical question. Ryan did not ask abstract philosophical questions. He asked questions that were attached to something specific, something he was trying to work out, and the working out required external input that he could not get by asking directly. He had been asking about Garrett. The question was whether Ryan had seen something that worried him, or felt something that worried him, and had decided not to pursue it because pursuing it would cost more than he was willing to pay. That was a different thing from not knowing. Not knowing is innocent. Choosing not to pursue knowing when the knowing is available to you, when the evidence is close enough to touch, is something else. I had spent 30 years working with people who knew things they had decided not to know. I recognized the shape of it. The letter was in my hand again. I had not realized I had picked it back up. I had always chosen the mission. Every time the mission and something personal had come into conflict, I had chosen the mission. And I had told myself it was because the mission mattered, and personal considerations were a luxury that the work could not afford. But this time, the mission and my son were not in conflict. They were the same thing. And whatever Ryan knew or didn't know, whatever he had decided or not decided, he was my son. He was sitting in a cage that was being built around him, and the door was not yet locked. I put the letter back in the envelope back in the gray metal box, the box back on the shelf. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark for a moment. Then I went to bed, and for the first time in 11 days, I slept. The call from Pete came at 10:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the meeting in his office. Earl. His voice had the specific flatness of a man delivering information he has already processed so that you can process it without the additional weight of his reaction. 2 agents went into Ryan's clinic 20 minutes ago, Nashville field office. I have a contact who flagged it. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and the notes I had been compiling on Garrett's financial structure. I set the pen down. How long have they been in there? Pete checked. 23 minutes now. Is he alone? His office manager is there. 2 patients were in treatment rooms when they arrived. The agents asked to speak with Ryan privately. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window. The farm looked the way it always looked at mid-morning in November. The fields gone gray and brown, the tree line bare, the sky the color of old pewter. Does Garrett know yet? Unknown. Pete paused. Earl, this moved faster than Danny projected. Someone accelerated the inquiry. What does that mean? It means either the suspicious activity report triggered a higher-level review than expected, or someone with knowledge of the inquiry pushed it forward. He let that sit for a moment. Either way, the document requests we were expecting in 6 to 8 weeks just became today. I picked up my jacket from the chair by the door. I'm going to Ryan, I said. Pete said carefully, that might not be the best move right now. If the agents are still there and they see you arrive, it complicates the picture. You're a known quantity in the intelligence community. Your presence will generate questions we're not ready to answer yet. He was right. I put the jacket back on the chair. I'll wait, I said. I did not wait well. I paced the kitchen for 18 minutes, which is not something I do often. Pacing is a way of expending anxiety that you cannot afford to expend, and I had spent 30 years learning to hold anxiety still and use it as fuel rather than noise. That morning I paced anyway, because the thing generating the anxiety was not a mission or an operation or a professional problem. It was my son sitting in his office while federal agents asked him questions about money he did not know was stolen, about accounts he did not know were criminal, about a structure that had been built around him for 18 months while he trusted the man who built it. At 11:22, my phone rang. Ryan's name on the screen. I answered before the second ring. Dad. His voice was wrong. Not the careful, slightly distant voice he had used for the past 3 years. The voice that had Garrett's fingerprints on it. The voice of a man who had learned to perform normalcy in his father's presence. This was the other voice. The one from before. The one that came out of him at 12 years old when he fell off the barn roof and broke his collarbone. And I heard him call for me from 30 yards away and covered the distance without knowing I was running. I'm here, I said, a breath on the other end, long and unsteady. Dad, there were FBI agents at my clinic. They just left. They asked me about Apex Holdings and some accounts, and they showed me documents with my signature on them, and I don't. He stopped. He tried again. I don't understand what I signed. I don't understand what any of it means. His voice dropped. I called Garrett, and he didn't answer. I've called 4 times. Of course Garrett hadn't answered. Garrett had known this was coming before Ryan did, and Garrett had made his calculations, and answering Ryan's calls had not made the list. I know, I said. A silence. Then, what do you mean, you know? This was the moment. I had been thinking about this moment since the night in the locked room when I read Eleanor's letter, since the morning in Pete's office when Danny put the 3rd folder on the desk, since the parking lot 3 weeks ago when I watched Garrett push a brochure into my chest and Ryan looked at the ground. I had been thinking about what to say and how much to say and when. And I had not arrived at a clean answer, because there was not a clean answer. Only a series of choices with different costs attached to each of them.
I need you to listen to me carefully, I said. Can you do that? Another unsteady breath.
Yeah.
I need you to go home. Not to the clinic. Not to your house. To the farm.
Can you come to the farm?
Silence.
I could hear him thinking. I could hear the particular quality of silence that means a person is deciding whether to trust something they are not sure about.
Dad, he said slowly. What's going on?
I'll explain everything when you get here, I said. All of it. But I need you here first, and I need you to come without calling Garrett again, and I need you to not talk to anyone else until we've spoken. Can you do that?
Another long silence. Outside my kitchen window, the pewter sky had darkened slightly at the edges, the way Tennessee skies do before they decide to do something about the weather.
Ryan, I said. I know this is frightening. I know you're scared and confused, and Garrett isn't answering, and nothing makes sense right now. But I need you to trust me, just for the drive out here. Can you trust me that far?
The silence on the other end was different this time. Not the silence of a man deciding whether to trust something uncertain. The silence of a man who has been making one decision for 3 years and is making a different one for the first time.
Yeah, Ryan said.
Okay, I'll come out.
I'll have food ready, I said, because that was what I always said. Because some things do not require elaboration.
I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I called Pete.
Ryan's coming to the farm, I said. The agents visited the clinic this morning. I know, Pete said. Danny's already working on it. There's something else, Earl. I waited.
Garrett's office manager filed a call log with his answering service this morning.
A call came in at 10:15 before the agents went to Ryan's clinic. The caller ID traced back to a burner purchased at a convenience store in Antioch 2 days ago. Pete paused. Someone warned Garrett before the agents went to see Ryan. He knew it was coming. He's been preparing since 10:15 this morning.
I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall.
It was 11:38. Garrett had had an hour and 23 minutes to move whatever he needed to move and prepare whatever he needed to prepare.
Pete, I said,
how quickly can you get Danny and the others together?
Tonight, if you need it.
I need it, I said. And Pete. Tell Danny to bring everything. Whatever we have, whatever we can get, all of it. We're out of time for the careful version of this.
I understand, Pete said.
I hung up and stood in the kitchen looking at the gray November fields through the window. Son, I thought. I'm sorry it took me this long. But I'm here now, and I need you to believe for just a little while longer that your father is enough.
There is a number I had not dialed in 8 years.
Not because I had forgotten it, but because dialing it meant something specific, meant crossing a line between the life I had been living on the farm and the life I had lived before the farm. And I had not been willing to cross that line until I was certain the crossing was necessary. I was certain now. I dialed at 2 in the afternoon, sitting in the locked room with the lamp on and the files open around me. The phone rang 3 times.
Colonel.
The voice on the other end was 61 years old and belonged to a man named Vincent Carey, who had run signals intelligence for my unit for 11 years and currently operated a cybersecurity consulting firm in Atlanta that did, among other things, the kind of forensic financial analysis that most firms did not know how to do and most clients did not know how to ask for.
Vincent, I said,
I need you.
A pause of approximately 2 seconds.
When do you need me?
Tonight.
Another pause shorter. I'll be there by 7.
That was the thing about the people I had worked with.
They did not ask unnecessary questions. They had learned over years of work in rooms where the wrong question at the wrong time had consequences. To assess the essential information and respond to it directly. I needed Vincent. Tonight was when I needed him. Those were the essential facts, and Vincent had responded to them. I made 3 more calls over the next 40 minutes. Walt Greer, 59 years old, former Army counterintelligence, currently running a private security firm in Memphis. Walt had a specific skill set related to physical surveillance and the documentation of evidence in ways that were legally defensible, which was a rarer combination than most people understood. He said he would drive up that afternoon. Sandra Okafor, 55 years old, former Treasury Department financial crimes analyst, now in private practice in Nashville, 4 blocks from Pete's office. Sandra had worked 2 of the same networks I had worked in the early 2000s, and understood the financial architecture of organized crime the way an architect understands a building she has designed herself. She said she would bring her laptop and her files. And finally, a number I had not dialed in 11 years, belonging to a man I had not spoken to since a debriefing in a federal building in Washington, that had ended with a handshake and the mutual understanding that we would not be in contact unless the circumstances were extraordinary. The circumstances were extraordinary. Frank Delgado was 64 years old and had spent 27 years in the DEA before transitioning to a role in a joint federal task force that I was not at liberty to describe in detail even now. What I could say was that Frank had access to databases and institutional relationships that the rest of us did not, and that he owed me a debt from 2011 that he had told me, sitting in a car outside a building in Laredo, Texas, that he intended to repay whenever I named the terms. I was naming the terms. Frank answered on the first ring, listened for 90 seconds without interrupting, and said he would have preliminary database results to me by morning. By 3:30 that afternoon, the network was assembled. Pete had arranged the use of his conference room for the evening meeting, and Danny was already there when I arrived at 4, spreading documents across the long table with the methodical attention of a man who believes that the physical arrangement of evidence affects the quality of thinking about it. I had always found this quality of Danny's useful. Walt arrived at 5:40 with a hard drive and a bag that clinked when he set it down, which I chose not to inquire about. Sandra arrived at 6 with her laptop already open and 3 years of financial analysis on organized crime networks in Tennessee loaded and cross-referenced. Vincent pulled into the parking garage at 6:58, which was consistent with his general approach to deadlines. We worked for 2 hours. I laid out the complete picture, everything from the files, everything from Pete and Danny's investigation, everything Ryan had said at the kitchen table and what I believed it meant. The group listened the way this group always listened, with the focused attention of people who know that the time for questions comes after the information is complete. When I finished, Sandra spoke first. The apex structure is consistent with what we saw in the Memphis network in 2015, she said. Same jurisdictional layering, same use of management consulting fees as the transfer mechanism. It's a template. Someone taught Garrett Cole how to build this. Or Garrett Cole has been doing this long enough to have developed the template himself. Either way tells us something about how deep this goes, Pete said. Vincent had been running searches on his laptop during the briefing. He turned the screen toward the table. Apex Holdings has 3 subsidiary accounts I can find in the initial sweep. The one connected to Ryan's practice is the smallest. He let that sit for a moment. There are 2 others. Different source businesses, same architecture. Garrett has done this before, Walt said. Ryan isn't the first. Almost certainly not, Vincent said. I had suspected this, but had not confirmed it. Knowing it changed the scope of what we were dealing with, which changed the urgency of what needed to happen next. We need someone inside Garrett's operation, I said. Not deep inside, peripheral. Someone who has access to the document flow and is positioned to be approached. Sandra looked at me. You have someone in mind. Marcus Webb, I said. Garrett's legal assistant. 3 years in the role, handles case files and document preparation. Pete's background check shows he's been passed over for promotion twice, and his salary hasn't increased in 18 months. He's also carrying significant personal debt, which Pete's contact at the credit bureau confirmed this morning. A man who feels undervalued and is financially stressed, Walt said. Potentially motivated. Potentially, I said. Or potentially already looking for a way out that serves his own interests. Either way, he's the accessible point of entry. How do you want to approach it? Pete asked. Carefully, I said. I'll meet him myself. Neutral location. Nothing that can be used against him or us. I'll make the case on its merits and see how he responds. The meeting with Marcus Webb happened the following afternoon at a coffee shop in Germantown, a neighborhood on the north side of Nashville that was busy enough for anonymity and close enough to Garrett's office to seem coincidental if Marcus happened to mention it. Marcus Webb was 32 years old and looked tired in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavier than his paycheck for longer than he anticipated. He was slight, careful with his movements, and he sat across from me in the corner booth with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on the table for the first 3 minutes of our conversation. I told him what I could tell him without compromising the investigation. I told him what I knew about Apex Holdings and the management consulting fees and the document structure. I told him that federal investigators were already involved and that the question of who was responsible and who was complicit was going to be answered with or without his help, and that the difference between those two outcomes would matter significantly to the people whose names appeared in the relevant documents. Marcus Webb listened. He asked 2 questions, both of which were the right questions, which told me he understood more about the situation than he had wanted anyone to know. Then he agreed to cooperate. He agreed quickly. He agreed without negotiating, without asking for guarantees, without the kind of careful positioning that a person does when they are making a genuine calculation about risk and benefit. He just said yes, and looked at me with an expression that I recognized after a moment as relief. The expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to give him a reason to do the thing he already wanted to do. I drove back to the farm in the early dark and sat at the kitchen table for a while before calling Pete. In 30 years of intelligence work, I said when Pete picked up, I learned one thing above everything else. Pete waited. When something comes too easy, I said it's because someone wants you to have it. A silence on Pete's end. You think Webb's been sent. I think we need to find out before we give him anything real. How do you want to test it? The same way you always test it, I said. You give a man a piece of information that only he has, and then you wait to see where it appears. Marcus Webb called the next morning at 8:43 with the first batch of information. He was thorough. I will give him that. He provided specific document numbers, filing dates, account routing information connected to Apex Holdings, and the names of 2 additional shell entities that Vincent had not yet found in his database sweep. He spoke with the careful precision of a man who had been preparing the information in advance, which was itself a data point. A genuinely nervous insider providing information spontaneously does not speak with that kind of preparation. He sounds hesitant. He trails off. He second-guesses the relevance of details. Marcus Webb sounded like a man reciting something he had rehearsed. I took notes and asked follow-up questions, and gave him nothing of substance in return, which was the correct protocol for a first exchange. You receive, you analyze, you assess the source. Before you give the source anything they can use, basic principle. I had taught it to junior officers in rooms that do not officially exist, and I had never needed it more than I needed it in the kitchen of my farm on a Wednesday morning in November. After the call, I drove to Pete's office and laid out what Marcus had provided. Sandra spent 40 minutes cross-referencing the document numbers and account information against her existing analysis. Vincent ran the new shell entity names through his databases. Pete made calls to 2 contacts in the Nashville financial community who could verify routing information without triggering alerts. The results came back by noon. Most of what Marcus had given us was accurate. The document numbers matched. The routing information was real. The 2 additional shell entities existed and connected to the Apex structure in the way Marcus had described. On the surface, It was a significant contribution. The kind of inside information that would take weeks to develop through external investigation. There was one problem. Sandra found it. She set her coffee down and turned her laptop toward me without saying anything first, which was her way of letting the information speak before she interpreted it. The filing date Marcus gave for the second shell entity incorporation, she said. It's wrong by 11 days. She pointed to the screen. The actual filing date is here, in the Nevada Secretary of State records. Marcus said it was incorporated in March. It was incorporated in February. I looked at the screen. The discrepancy was small. 11 days in a transaction history that spanned 18 months. The kind of detail that a genuine insider might simply misremember. The kind that an investigator checking quickly might not catch. But Marcus Webb had been Garrett's legal assistant for 3 years. Document dates were his professional vocabulary. A legal assistant who misremembers an incorporation date by 11 days is either careless or lying. And Marcus Webb had not struck me as careless. You think it's deliberate, Pete said. I think it's possible, I said. Which means we tested. The test was simple. I called Marcus that afternoon and gave him a piece of information that did not exist. I told him that our investigation had identified a financial account in the Cayman Islands connected to Apex Holdings, registered under the name Tidewater Consulting Group. I told him we believed this account held a significant portion of the stolen funds, and that our next step was to file for international asset disclosure through Treasury. None of this was true. Tidewater Consulting Group did not exist. The Cayman account did not exist. The Treasury filing was not something we were considering at this stage. I told Marcus to keep the information confidential, that it was sensitive, and that premature disclosure could compromise the investigation. Then I waited. I did not have to wait long. Vincent had, with Frank Delgado's assistance, established a passive monitoring protocol on Garrett's primary email accounts. The kind of monitoring that sits at the edge of what is legally permissible for private investigators, and that I had decided was justified given the circumstances. It was not evidence we could use in court. It was intelligence. There is a difference. And I had spent 30 years understanding that difference. At 6:17 that evening, an email arrived in Garrett Cole's inbox. The sender was an anonymous account created that morning through a privacy service. The content was brief, 5 sentences. It referenced Tidewater Consulting Group by name. It referenced the Cayman account. It referenced the Treasury filing. Every piece of false information I had given Marcus Webb at 2 in the afternoon was sitting in Garrett Cole's inbox by 6:17 in the evening. Vincent called me while I was reading the forwarded message. 4 hours and 17 minutes, he said. From the time you gave Webb the information to the time it arrived in Cole's inbox. He paused. That's not a nervous insider who happened to mention something. That's a reporting protocol. Webb has a specific way of getting information to Cole, and he used it within the same business day. I sat in Pete's conference room with the printed email in front of me and the rest of the group around the table. The room was quiet for a moment. So Garrett knows, Walt said. He knows we're investigating, I said. He knows we have an inside source, or he suspects it, which is why he sent Marcus. He doesn't know who we are specifically, or at least he didn't when Marcus started. He may know more now. Sandra looked at the email. He knows about the Cayman account, which means he knows we were testing Webb. Which means he knows Webb failed the test. Which means, Pete said slowly, that Garrett Cole now knows his inside man has been identified, and that the people investigating him are sophisticated enough to run a test that specific. I set the email down. Garrett had played the information game, and he had played it well enough to get an asset inside our investigation within 48 hours of Marcus Webb's initial meeting. That was not the work of an amateur. That was the work of a man who had been operating in this environment for years, who understood that any investigation could be countered with better intelligence, who had built an infrastructure capable of responding to threats quickly and surgically. He was better at this than I had expected, which meant the next move had to be better than he expected. I looked around the table at Pete and Danny and Sandra and Vincent and Walt. 5 people who had given up their evenings and their normal lives because I had called and asked them to. He knows we're here, I said. So we stopped pretending he doesn't. I looked at Pete. Call Danny. Tell him we're moving to the accelerated timeline. Pete nodded. How accelerated? I thought about the burner phone call at 10:15 in the morning, about the email at 6:17 in the evening, about Garrett's preparations, whatever they were, that had been running since the morning the FBI walked into Ryan's clinic. 48 hours, I said. We have 48 hours before he does something we can't reverse. The car came down the gravel road at 9:15 the following morning. I was on the porch with coffee when I heard it. A dark sedan moving at the careful speed of someone who is unfamiliar with gravel roads and does not want to damage the undercarriage of a leased vehicle. I watched it come without moving from my chair. In 30 years of intelligence work, I had learned that stillness communicates more than motion in moments like this. Motion says you were not expecting them. Stillness says you were. The man who got out was 40 years old, give or take, in a gray suit that had not been purchased in Nashville. He carried a leather portfolio and moved with the specific purposefulness of a man on a professional errand who has been briefed on his objective and is following instructions. Not a partner, an associate. Someone sent to deliver something, not to negotiate. I did not get up. He came to the base of the porch steps and looked up at me. Mr. Maddox. That's right. He opened the portfolio and produced a document 3 pages held together with a binder clip. He held it out. I'm here on behalf of Cole Legal Group. This is a petition for a formal cognitive competency evaluation filed in Davidson County Probate Court this morning. He paused. The petition has been signed by your son-in-law, Garrett Cole, as an interested party, and by a licensed physician attesting to observed indicators of cognitive decline. You'll receive formal notice from the court within 5 business days, but Mr. Cole wanted to ensure you received advance courtesy notice. Courtesy notice. I looked at the document without taking it. Garrett had moved the guardianship petition forward. Not in 3 months, not in 6 weeks, not in 48 hours from last night's decision to accelerate. He had filed it this morning, which meant he had prepared the filing before last night, before Marcus Webb's failed intelligence operation, before he knew we had identified his timeline. He had been running 2 tracks simultaneously, the intelligence operation through Marcus and the legal operation through the probate court. And the legal track had been ready to execute independently of whatever happened with the other. That was the move of a man who planned for contingencies. I took the document. Thank you, I said. The associate looked slightly surprised. He had, I suspected, been briefed to expect resistance. An agitated old man, perhaps. Confusion demands to speak with Garrett. An emotional response that could be documented and cited in the petition as additional evidence of instability. He had not been briefed for courtesy. Is there anything you'd like me to convey to Mr. Cole? He asked. Tell him I received the document, I said, and that I look forward to the evaluation. The associate wrote something in his portfolio, nodded once, and walked back to the sedan. I watched him navigate the gravel road back to the county highway. Then I picked up my phone and called Pete. He filed this morning, I said, when Pete answered. I know. Danny's contact at the probate court flagged it 20 minutes ago. Pete's voice was controlled, which was how Pete's voice always was, but there was something underneath it that was not quite controlled. A physician attestation, Earl. He got a doctor to sign a declaration of observed cognitive decline. Who? We're working on that. The name on the attestation is a doctor named Farwell, licensed in Tennessee. But the license has a disciplinary notation from 2 years ago, related to improper documentation. Pete paused. He found a doctor whose professional credibility is already compromised. Someone who needed the work badly enough to sign something he shouldn't have.
Can we challenge the attestation?
Absolutely. The disciplinary record alone is grounds for challenging the doctor's standing as a qualified examiner. But challenging it takes time, and time is what Garrett is counting on. Once the petition is filed, there's a mandatory evaluation period. During that period, there are limits on what you can do with certain assets. I understood. The petition was not intended to succeed immediately. It was intended to create legal friction, to slow down my ability to act, to give Garrett the days he needed to complete whatever he was completing. I had anticipated this. Not the specific timing, but the general shape of it. 3 weeks ago, after the meeting with Pete and Danny, when we first understood the full scope of what Garrett was planning, I had called a physician I had known for 20 years. Dr. Carol Hendricks, former Army Medical Corps, now in private practice in Nashville, with a specialty in geriatric medicine and cognitive assessment. I had explained what I believed was coming, and Carol had scheduled a full cognitive competency evaluation that I had completed 11 days ago. The results were in my filing cabinet. 42 pages of assessment data, cognitive scores, professional observations, signed and sealed by a physician whose record was entirely clean and whose standing in the Tennessee medical community was unimpeachable. I told Pete. The silence on his end lasted exactly 2 seconds. You already have a counter-evaluation. Completed 11 days ago, I said. Perfect scores across every assessed domain. Carol will testify if necessary. Pete made a sound that might have been a laugh in a different context. Earl, he said, you anticipated the petition before we even knew about the offshore transfers. I anticipated the shape of it, I said. Garrett is a lawyer. Lawyers build legal structures. The guardianship petition was always going to be part of whatever he was building. I just wanted to have the counter already in place before he knew I was looking. That's going to significantly complicate his timeline. That's the point, I said. But Pete, the petition tells us something. He filed it this morning, independently of what happened with Marcus last night. That means he had 2 separate tracks running, and the legal track was already ready to execute. Which means there's probably a 3rd track we haven't identified yet. Pete was quiet for a moment. I'll call Danny. Do that. And Pete, ask Danny to check departure records. Private aviation out of Nashville, Smyrna, Murfreesboro. Any of the smaller fields within an hour of the city. Why departure records? Because a man with 2 operational tracks already running, and a 3rd we haven't found, who has just been told by his inside man that he's been identified, who has just filed a legal petition that is going to get challenged within days, is not a man who intends to stay in Nashville much longer. Another silence. When Danny called back 40 minutes later, he confirmed it. Charter flight booked out of Smyrna Airport, Danny said. 48 hours from now. Filed under a corporate account registered to one of the Apex subsidiary entities. Destination: a private airfield outside San Jose, Costa Rica. Costa Rica, where the offshore holding company's listed asset, the property Pete had identified weeks ago, was located. I sat down in the kitchen chair. 48 hours, I said. He's not waiting. He's going. Danny said, Earl. If he gets on that plane with what he's moved offshore, Ryan's name is the one left on the accounts. Ryan becomes the primary domestic subject. Garrett disappears into a jurisdiction that does not have a straightforward extradition relationship with the United States. And Ryan spends the next several years of his life explaining signatures on documents he didn't understand. I know, I said. The 48-hour timeline I had declared last night had just become literal. I looked at the gravel road outside the kitchen window, at the place where the dark sedan had disappeared an hour ago, carrying its attorney back to Garrett Cole, with the news that the old man on the farm had received his courtesy notice with disturbing calm. Good, I thought. Let Garrett think about that calm. Let him wonder what it means.
48 hours. I had built operations in less time, in worse conditions, with fewer resources and higher stakes. I had done it in places where the consequences of failure were measured in lives rather than years in a courtroom. This time, the consequence of failure was my son. I picked up the phone and called Pete. "Get everyone together," I said. "Tonight. We're done waiting." We met at Pete's office at 8 that evening, all of them. Pete and Danny and Sandra and Vincent and Walt arranged around the conference table the way they had been 2 nights ago, but different now, in a specific way that I recognized from other rooms in other circumstances. 2 nights ago we had been building something. Tonight we were defending it, which is a different kind of work and requires a different quality of attention. I laid out what we had. The 48-hour window before Garrett's charter flight, the guardianship petition in probate court, the FBI inquiry with Ryan's name on it, the offshore accounts and the Costa Rica property, and the $240,000 taken from Ryan's practice over 18 months. The 3 Apex subsidiary accounts Vincent had identified, suggesting Ryan was not the first and would not have been the last. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms go quiet when the people in them are assessing a situation that is worse than they had hoped and better than they had feared. Sandra spoke first. "The 48-hour window is real, but it's not our primary constraint." She turned her laptop toward the table. "The charter flight is trackable, reportable, and interceptable through normal federal channels. If we get the right information to the right people tonight, that flight doesn't happen. The primary constraint is the offshore money. Once it moves beyond the current holding accounts into the final destination structure, recovery becomes significantly more complicated." "How much is currently in the holding accounts?" Pete asked. Vincent answered. "Based on what we can see, approximately $840,000 distributed across 3 accounts." He paused. "There's additional value in the Apex holding structure itself, the shell company infrastructure, the client relationships. If Garrett leaves the country, he leaves most of that behind. He's not taking everything. He's taking enough." $840,000 was enough to disappear comfortably into a country with limited extradition cooperation and live very well for a very long time. "I need to make a call," I said. "Tonight." I had been thinking about this since Danny confirmed the charter flight. There are correct channels and there are efficient channels, and they are not always the same thing. The correct channel for the information we had was through the FBI inquiry that was already open through Danny's contacts, through the formal process of turning over evidence to investigators who would then proceed through their own institutional protocols. The efficient channel was different. I had spent 30 years cultivating relationships with people in federal law enforcement who understood that intelligence and law enforcement were different disciplines with different rules, and that sometimes the disciplines needed to communicate directly. Frank Delgado was one of those people. But there was another. Her name was Catherine Marsh, and she was the special agent in charge of the FBI's Nashville field office. I had worked with her predecessor's predecessor on a joint operation in 2008, and Catherine had been a junior agent on the periphery of that operation, observant and precise, and the kind of person who remembers things and draws accurate conclusions from them. She had risen appropriately. We had spoken twice in the years since, both times at the initiative of her office, on matters where my background was relevant. I called her from Pete's conference room at 8:47. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Colonel Maddox," she said. Not surprised, which told me Frank Delgado had already made a call on my behalf, or that her office had flagged my name in connection with the Apex inquiry, or both. "I need 40 minutes of your time tonight," I said. "In person." She was quiet for a moment. "This is about the Apex Holdings inquiry." "It is. And about a charter flight leaving Smyrna Airport in approximately 40 hours. Another moment of quiet. "I'll be at my office in 30 minutes, she said. I drove to the Federal Building on Broadway alone. The rest of the group stayed at Pete's office, working through the financial documentation, organizing the evidence into formats that would be useful for formal handover. Sandra was preparing a written analysis. Vincent was compiling the digital records. Walt was reviewing the chain of custody on everything physical we had gathered. Catherine Marsh was 52 years old, precise and unhurried in a way that suggested deep reserves of patience that she deployed strategically. She listened to 40 minutes of briefing without interrupting, taking notes in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil, her expression neutral and attentive. When I finished, she set the pencil down. "The physician attestation in the guardianship petition," she said. "The doctor's name, Farwell. Thomas Farwell. Disciplinary notation on his Tennessee license 2 years ago for improper documentation in an insurance case." She wrote it down. "The charter flight, Smyrna Airport. 40 hours. Filed under a corporate account, registered to one of the Apex subsidiaries." I gave her the account name and the filing reference number that Danny had obtained. She wrote those down too. "And your son, Ryan Maddox," I said. "Physical therapist, Brentwood. He signed documents he did not understand, prepared and presented by his spouse. He is a victim of the scheme, not a participant." Catherine looked at me steadily. "You understand that determination is ours to make, not yours." "I understand that completely," I said. "I am providing information. The determination is yours." She nodded once. "We'll need everything you have. Formally with chain of custody documentation tonight if possible. I'll have it to your office by midnight." She stood and extended her hand. "Colonel," she paused, "you should know that your son's name was on our preliminary inquiry list as a subject of interest, not a target. The distinction matters internally. Given what you've provided tonight, I expect that distinction will become clearer very quickly." I shook her hand. "Thank you," I said. I drove back to Pete's office. The group had the documentation ready by 10:30. Walt drove it to the Federal Building at 11 with Sandra's written analysis and Vincent's digital compilation and Danny's financial reconstruction, 412 pages of evidence built over 6 weeks by 5 people who had given up their evenings because I had asked them to. I stayed at Pete's office after the others left. Sat in the conference room with the lights on and the city quiet outside the windows. Tomorrow, I needed to talk to Ryan. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He needed to know enough to do what needed to be done, and he needed to hear it from me, not from federal agents or from the news or from the collapse of his marriage in a courtroom. He deserved to hear it from his father. I picked up my phone and called him. "Ryan?" I said when he answered, his voice careful and slightly braced. "I need to see you tomorrow morning. There are things I need to tell you. Things I should have told you a long time ago." A pause. "How long ago?" he asked. I thought about the locked room, about the filing cabinets and the hard drives, and the gray metal box with Eleanor's letter. About 30 years of careful invisibility and the cost of it, and what it had built, and what it had prevented. "About 30 years, I said. The silence on the other end was long. Then, "Okay, Dad. I'll be there." Ryan arrived at 7:30 in the morning. I had been up since 5, which was not unusual, but that morning the early hours had a different quality to them. I had made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what I was going to say, and in what order, and what the words would cost not just me, but him, and whether the cost was one he was prepared to pay. On a Thursday morning in November, with 40 hours left on a clock he did not know was running. There is no clean way to tell your son that the man he married has been stealing from him for 18 months, that the federal government has his name in an inquiry file, that his father has spent 6 weeks building a case with people his son has never met, that the father he thought was a retired logistics worker in a farmhouse is something considerably different from that. There is no sequence of words that makes any of that land softly. So I had stopped trying to find the clean version and decided to tell him the truth, in the order that the truth had revealed itself to me, starting at the beginning and going forward, because that was the only way to give him the full picture, without the distortion that comes from trying to manage how a person receives difficult information. He knocked once and came in the way he always did, and stood in the kitchen doorway with his jacket still on. He looked like he had not slept well, which he probably had not. I poured him coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from him. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup the way he had done since he was old enough for coffee. And he looked at me with the expression of a man who has agreed to hear something he is not sure he wants to hear. I started talking. I told him about the 30 years. Not everything, not the operational details that were still classified and would remain so, but the shape of it. Military intelligence, joint task forces, the kind of work that does not appear in public records and is not discussed at dinner tables. I told him why I had kept it from him, the decision I had made the night after Eleanor's funeral, and what I had believed about protecting him from the weight of it, and what I had come to understand more recently about the other reason, the one Eleanor had seen and written into that letter. Ryan listened without interrupting. His expression did not change much, which was something he had gotten from me. The ability to hold a reaction still while the information completed itself. He drank his coffee and kept his eyes on the table and let me talk. When I finished the part about who I was, I moved to the part about Garrett. I told him about the parking lot, about recognizing the posture and the peripheral awareness, about the locked room and the files and the name on page 47, about Pete and Danny and the 6 weeks of investigation, about Apex Holdings and the management consulting fees and the $240,000, about the FBI inquiry and his name in it, and what it meant, and what it did not mean, and what Catherine Marsh had said about the distinction between subject of interest and target. I put the summary document Sandra had prepared on the table between us. 12 pages clear language, organized chronologically. Ryan looked at it, but did not pick it up yet. I told him about the guardianship petition, and Dr. Farwell, and the cognitive evaluation I had completed 11 days ago. I told him about Marcus Webb, and the test with the false information, and the 4 hours and 17 minutes. I told him about the charter flight and the 40 hours. Then I stopped talking and waited. Ryan sat for a long time without saying anything. He picked up the summary document and read the first 3 pages slowly, then set it down. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the window. Outside, the November morning was gray and still, the fields bare the tree line, dark against a sky that had not decided what it wanted to do yet. "Dad," he said finally. His voice was careful. "How long have you known about Garrett, specifically?" 6 weeks since I confirmed it, I said. "I suspected it the night of the parking lot." He nodded slowly. "Okay." He was quiet for another moment. "And the FBI? They came to my clinic because of Apex Holdings." "Yes. The inquiry was opened before I engaged Catherine Marsh. It was triggered by a suspicious activity report from your bank. Garrett's structure generated patterns that the bank's monitoring system flagged." Ryan set his hands flat on the table. Another quality he had gotten from me. The physical gesture of a man making himself be still when stillness was difficult. "I need to tell you something," he said. I waited. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "With Garrett. With the business arrangements. I've known for about a year. I did not move. I did not change my expression. I simply waited for the rest of it, the way I had waited in rooms for 30 years when the important thing was about to be said." "Not the specifics," Ryan continued. "I didn't know about Apex Holdings or the fee structure or any of the details you just told me. But I knew the numbers felt wrong. I'd get a client who told me they'd paid a certain amount, and I'd check the books, and the number would be different. smaller. And Garrett would explain it as a timing issue or a currency conversion on an out-of-state payment or an administrative adjustment. He shook his head, and I let him explain it. I let him explain it every time.
Why? I asked.
Ryan looked at me. It was a direct look, the kind that costs something.
Because I didn't know what to do about it, he said. Because I didn't want to know what it meant if the explanations were wrong. And because... He stopped. Because what? He looked back at the table. Because I didn't think you could help me. He said it quietly, without accusation, which somehow made it worse. I didn't think you were. I didn't know what you were. But whatever I thought you were, it wasn't someone who could fix this. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird moved through the tree line. The coffee had gone cold in both our cups. I had spent 30 years protecting Ryan from the weight of what I was. I had built a wall between my professional self and my father self. And I had told myself the wall was for him, and Eleanor had known it was also for me. And I had finally admitted that to myself, reading her letter in the locked room. But I had not fully understood until this moment what the wall had cost. It had cost Ryan a father he could come to when the world got complicated. It had cost him the knowledge that the man on the farm was someone who had spent 30 years solving problems that other people could not solve, and that this particular problem, as serious as it was within his capacity. It had cost him exactly the thing Eleanor had told me to make sure he had. I looked at my son. He was 31 years old and tired and carrying something he had been carrying alone for a year because he had not believed his father was enough. I'm here now, I said. Ryan looked up. I'm here, I said again. And I'm enough. I should have shown you that a long time ago. That's my failure, not yours. But I'm showing you now. His jaw tightened. He nodded once the sharp, single nod of a man accepting something he needed to accept. What do you need me to do? He asked. I told him. Not everything. The pieces he needed for the next 36 hours. The specific actions that required his cooperation. The things that only he could do, because only his name was on the relevant documents. He listened the way he had listened to the whole conversation, with the focused attention of a man who had decided to trust something and was following that decision through. When I finished, he said, "Okay, just that." Okay, it was enough. Ryan had never been to Pete's office before. He walked in at 2 that afternoon and stood in the conference room doorway for a moment, taking in the table covered in documents and laptops and coffee cups. The 5 people who looked up when he entered. The specific quality of focused attention that fills a room when the people in it have been working towards something for a long time and the end is finally close enough to see. I introduced him around the table. Pete, who shook Ryan's hand with the directness of a man who does not waste motion. Danny, who nodded and immediately returned to the financial reconstruction on his laptop, which was the highest form of respect Danny offered anyone. Sandra, who said it was good to meet him and meant it. Vincent, who looked at Ryan with the evaluative attention he gave everything and apparently found what he was looking for, because he gave a small nod of approval that Ryan probably did not know how to interpret, but that I knew meant Vincent had decided Ryan was going to be useful. Walt was at the window watching the street below and turned long enough to shake hands before turning back. Because Walt believed that someone should always be watching the street, and he had appointed himself. Ryan sat in the chair I indicated at the corner of the table where he could see everything, and looked at the assembled evidence of 6 weeks of work. He was quiet for a moment. "How long have these people been helping you?" he asked. Pete answered before I could. 6 weeks, he said. "Since your father called." Ryan looked at Pete. "Did you know about Garrett?" Pete shook his head. "Not until your father told me. But I had run a background on Cole's network 14 months ago for a different client, and kept a passive flag on the associated accounts. When Earl called, I had a head start." Ryan looked around the table. "These are all people you worked with," he said to me. "Some of them," I said. "Some of them owe me favors. Some of both." He was quiet for another moment, looking at the room. I watched his face and saw the thing I had been waiting to see. The thing that had been missing for 3 years. The careful blankness dissolving, replaced by something more honest. Grief, maybe, or the particular emotion that does not have a clean name. The one that arrives when you realize that something you thought was absent was actually present all along, just located somewhere you had not thought to look. "All right," he said. "Tell me what we need to do." I laid out the plan. 3 simultaneous actions in the next 24 hours. The first was Danny's responsibility. He had been in contact with Catherine Marsh's office since the previous night and was coordinating the formal evidence handover, a process that was ongoing but required Ryan's cooperation to complete. Specifically, Ryan needed to provide a signed statement confirming that he had not knowingly participated in the Apex Holdings scheme, that the signatures on the relevant documents were his, but that the documents had been presented to him as routine business agreements without full disclosure of their nature, and that he had observed financial discrepancies that he had reported to Garrett Cole and been given explanations that he now understood were false. It was a detailed statement. It required Ryan to be precise about specific instances, specific dates, specific conversations. Danny walked him through it for 40 minutes, asking questions, recording answers, building the kind of documented record that turns a victim's account from narrative into evidence. Ryan against every question without hesitation. He was good at it. He had Eleanor's memory for specific detail and my comfort with being precise under pressure. And the combination produced a witness account that Danny described when Ryan stepped out to use the restroom as exceptionally clean. The second action was Pete's. He had been working with a financial attorney in Nashville named Beverly Cho, who specialized in asset protection, and had spent the previous 24 hours preparing a series of legal filings that would, when submitted to the relevant courts, place a temporary protective order on the assets of Ryan's practice, pending the outcome of the federal inquiry. The protective order would accomplish 2 things. It would prevent any further transfers from the practice accounts through the Apex structure, and it would establish on the formal legal record that Ryan had taken proactive steps to cooperate with the investigation and protect the integrity of the relevant assets, which was exactly the kind of documented behavior that federal prosecutors took into account when making charging decisions. Beverly submitted the filings at 3:47 that afternoon. The third action required Ryan directly. Garrett had been calling Ryan's phone since the previous afternoon. 8 calls, all unanswered, which Ryan had managed, based on my instruction, to not speak with Garrett until we were ready. The calls had started as voicemails that Ryan described as calm and explanatory. Garrett's reasonable voice, the one I had heard in the parking lot. By the 8th call, the voicemails had changed. They were shorter, more directive. There was an edge in them that Ryan said he had heard before, in private, in moments when Garrett believed no one outside the 2 of them would ever know what he had said. Garrett was worried, which meant it was time to let him know his worry was justified. "I need you to send him a text message," I told Ryan. Nothing elaborate. 4 words. Ryan looked at me. I told him the 4 words. He thought about it for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and typed them and pressed send. The message said, "I know about Apex." 4 words. True, specific. Impossible for Garrett to interpret as anything other than what they were. Not an accusation, not a threat. A statement of fact that told Garrett 2 things simultaneously. That Ryan knew, and that Ryan had chosen to say so. Which meant Ryan was no longer the compliant presence Garrett had been counting on. Vincent was monitoring Garrett's digital activity through the protocol Frank Delgado had helped establish. He looked up from his laptop 40 seconds after Ryan sent the message. "Cole's phone just connected to a VPN," he said. He's trying to access the offshore account structures. Sandra looked up. Is he moving money? Vincent watched his screen. Attempting to. He paused. The accounts have frozen. The room went quiet. Beverly Cho's protective order filings had included an emergency asset freeze request, supported by the FBI inquiry documentation and the evidence package delivered the previous night. Catherine Marsh's office had processed it through the federal court at 3:51 that afternoon. 4 minutes after Beverly submitted the state-level filings, Garrett Cole had tried to move $840,000 and found that the doors had been locked while he was watching the other entrance. Ryan was looking at Vincent's laptop screen from across the table, though he could not read what was on it. What just happened? He asked. Pete answered. Garrett just discovered that the money he was planning to take to Costa Rica is no longer accessible, he said. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Good. It was the right word. Simple and sufficient. Walt turned from the window. Cole's building, he said. Activity in the parking garage. He's leaving. Vincent looked at his screen. His phone just went dark. He pulled the battery. I stood up. I looked at Danny. Call Catherine. Danny was already dialing. The plan had been running for 24 hours. In 24 more, it would be finished. Garrett Cole was in a parking garage pulling the battery from his phone, which meant he had decided that the situation had changed in ways he had not planned for, and that his next move needed to be made without a digital record. It was the move of a man who still believed he had options. He was about to learn otherwise. The next 24 hours had the particular quality of time that I remembered from operations in the field, the way hours compress when every minute contains something that matters, and there is no margin for the minutes that don't. Walt followed Garrett from the parking garage, not closely. Walt had spent 19 years doing this kind of work and understood that the value of surveillance is destroyed by its discovery. So he maintained the distance that allows a subject to feel unwatched while remaining fully observed. He used 2 vehicles and a third set of eyes, a former Memphis colleague named Torres, who had driven up that morning and positioned himself at the north end of Garrett's likely route. Garrett drove to his office building on Church Street, which was not surprising. A man whose financial accounts have just been frozen and whose offshore escape route has just been blocked has a limited set of rational responses. And one of them is to go to the place where his remaining assets are located, which for a lawyer means documents, case files, client records, the physical evidence of a practice that was about to become very interesting to several different federal agencies simultaneously. He was in the building for 41 minutes. Walt reported this from the parking structure across the street, his voice calm and specific in the way of men who have done this long enough that urgency does not require volume. He came out carrying 2 boxes, Walt said. Banker's boxes, the standard kind. Loaded them into his trunk. He paused. He's moving deliberately, not panicking, thinking. A man who is panicking does not carry banker's boxes in an organized fashion. He grabs what he can reach and moves fast and leaves things behind. Garrett was carrying boxes, which meant he had a list, a prioritized inventory of what he needed and what he was leaving, which meant he was still operating from a plan, even if the plan had been significantly degraded by the events of the past 24 hours. That was useful to know. A man with a plan, even a damaged one, will follow the plan to its next logical step, which meant Garrett's next move was predictable if you understood what the plan was trying to accomplish. Vincent had restored partial visibility into Garrett's digital activity after the VPN attempt failed, and Garrett switched to a different device. A tablet registered to one of the Apex subsidiary entities that Vincent had identified 2 days ago and flagged for monitoring. The tablet was active. He's accessing the offshore account structure, Vincent said. Not the frozen accounts. Something deeper in the structure. He watched his screen. There's a fourth account layer I didn't find in the initial sweep. He paused. It's smaller, significantly smaller than the main holding accounts. Maybe 60, 70,000. Possibly an emergency reserve. Sandra looked up from her laptop. Consistent with how these structures are built, you always have a reserve that's insulated from the main accounts in case the main accounts get compromised. Can we freeze it? Pete asked. Vincent and Danny exchanged a look. Danny picked up his phone and called Catherine Marsh's office. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When he hung up, he shook his head. The account is in a jurisdiction where we don't have an existing freeze order, he said. It would take 48 hours minimum to get the right paperwork in place. So he has $70,000 he can still access, Pete said. $70,000 was enough to buy a commercial airline ticket to a country with limited extradition cooperation and live modestly for a year while making other arrangements. It was not the $840,000 he had been planning to take. But it was not nothing. I looked at Ryan. He had been sitting at the corner of the table for the past 3 hours, watching and listening, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who is learning something important and knows it. He had not said much since the account freeze was confirmed. He was processing the way he had always processed things internally and thoroughly, which was something else he had gotten from me without either of us knowing it until now. Ryan, I said, does Garrett have any assets in your name that we haven't identified yet? Ryan thought for a moment. The practice equipment, he said. Some of it was purchased through a leasing arrangement that Garrett structured. The lease is in both our names. Sandra typed something. Which leasing company? Ryan gave her the name. Sandra cross-referenced it and looked up. That's one of the Apex subsidiaries, she said. The lease payments from Ryan's practice have been going into an account that Garrett controls. Is there equity in the equipment? Pete asked. Ryan calculated. Maybe 30,000. If he liquidated it fast, maybe 25. Pete looked at Beverly Cho's number on his phone. I'll get a protective order on the equipment. Give me 20 minutes. Walt called at 4:30. Garrett's at his house, he said. The mainline address. He's been inside for 20 minutes. I asked, is he packing? Can't confirm from outside. But the lights are on in the master bedroom and 2 other rooms. He's moving through the house. A man moving through his house in the late afternoon with the lights on in multiple rooms is either cleaning or selecting. Garrett was not cleaning. Catherine Marsh called at 5:15. We have a problem, she said. Her voice had the quality of someone delivering information that has just changed the parameters of a situation. The charter flight out of Smyrna. It was canceled this morning. 30 minutes after the account freeze. Garrett had been ahead of that move. Where does that leave us? I asked. We're monitoring commercial departures, she said. Nashville, Smyrna, Murfreesboro, all the regional fields. But Colonel, a man with resources and motivation, has more options than the ones we can monitor from here. I know, I said. We need him to come to us, she said. Or we need to know where he's going. I looked at the table. At Pete and Danny and Sandra and Vincent and Walt's voice coming through the phone speaker, and Ryan sitting at the corner with his hands flat on the table. A man with a damaged plan and $70,000 and 2 boxes of documents and a car with a full tank of gas. A man who had spent 3 years believing that the old man on the farm was the least consequential person in his life. I had one move left. Not a trap exactly. More an invitation. The kind that only works if the person you're inviting believes they still have something to gain from accepting it. I picked up my phone and called Garrett Cole's number. It rang 4 times. Then it connected. Silence on the other end. The specific silence of a man who has answered a call he did not expect and is deciding in real time whether that was a mistake. Garrett, I said. It's Earl. I think we should talk. In person. Tonight. The silence lasted long enough that I thought he might hang up. Then he said, Where? I told him. My office, I said. The one you don't know about yet. Another silence. Then, What time? 7 o'clock, I said. The line went quiet again for a moment. Then I'll be there. I set the phone down. Ryan was watching me from across the table. He's coming, I said. Ryan looked at me steadily. Is that safe? I thought about 30 years of rooms where safety was a variable you managed, rather than a condition you could guarantee. It will be, I said. The office Pete had arranged was on the 6th floor of a building on Commerce Street, 3 blocks from Garrett's office on Church, which was deliberate. I wanted Garrett to feel that he was on familiar ground, that the meeting was happening in territory he understood. Familiar ground makes people comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. The room was a standard corporate conference space rented by the hour, with a long table and 8 chairs and windows that faced north toward the Cumberland River. Pete had arranged it that morning through a property management company that did not ask questions. Vincent had spent an hour in the room before I arrived, doing the things Vincent did with rooms that were about to be used for something important. Catherine Marsh had 2 agents in the building, one in the lobby, one in the stairwell on the 6th floor. Not visible. Present. I arrived at 6:40 and sat at the far end of the table with my back to the window. This was also deliberate. Anyone entering the room would have to look toward the light to see my face clearly, which meant I would see theirs first. Pete was down the hall with Danny and Vincent monitoring. Ryan had wanted to come. I had said no. This was not a conversation Ryan needed to witness, and it was not a situation I was willing to put him in. He was at the farm. Walt was with him. At 7:03, the elevator opened, and Garrett Cole walked into the conference room. He was wearing the same kind of suit he always wore, expensive and well-fitted. But something in the way he was carrying it had changed. Suits are designed to project a specific kind of confidence, the confidence of a man whose resources are adequate to the occasion. Garrett's suit was projecting something slightly different this evening. The resources were there. The confidence was working harder than usual to keep up. He saw me at the far end of the table and stopped. For a moment, he did not say anything. He looked at me the way people look at something they are trying to place, the slight narrowing of focus that happens when a familiar element appears in an unexpected context. I waited. "Earl," he said finally. His voice was steady, which cost him something. I could see it cost him something. "Garrett," I said. "Sit down." He looked at the chairs along the table. He chose one in the middle, equidistant from both ends, which told me he was still making strategic decisions, even in this room, at this moment. Not close enough to suggest cooperation. Not far enough to suggest flight. He sat. "I thought you wanted to talk," he said. "I do," I said. "I've been wanting to talk to you for some time, actually. We've just never had the right setting." He looked around the room. The windows, the neutral furniture, the absence of anything personal. "This isn't your farm," he said. "No," I said. "This is my office. The one you don't know about." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear yet. Reassessment. He was recalculating, which was what Garrett Cole did when the situation changed, and he was good at it, faster than most people, which was part of how he had operated successfully for as long as he had. "What kind of office?" he asked. "The kind that's hard to explain briefly," I said. "But you have time. Let me try." I told him who I was. Not everything, but enough. 30 years of military intelligence, joint task forces, the kind of work that generates files, and the specific file that had his name on page 47 in the 2017 documentation, and the name Duval, and the wiretap transcript about using the lawyer who knew how to structure things. I watched his face while I talked. The reassessment was continuous, now rapid, and visible in the small adjustments of his expression. The way a man's face changes when he is processing information that requires him to fundamentally revise his understanding of a situation he thought he had mapped completely. "The old man on the farm," he said slowly when I finished.
His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Not quite disbelief, something closer to the specific vertigo of a person discovering that what they thought was solid ground is not ground at all. "The old man on the farm," I confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, his voice flattening into something that was trying to be controlled, "How long have you known?" "About you specifically." 6 weeks since I confirmed it. I suspected it the night in the VA parking lot. Something crossed his face at the mention of the parking lot. Not shame. Garrett Cole was not a man built for shame. But something adjacent to it. The recognition of a specific error and the cost of that error. "You were watching me that whole time," he said. "You made it easy," I said. "You assumed that age and silence meant powerless. They don't." He looked at the table. His hands were on the surface, flat, controlled. He was working very hard to maintain the surface of a man who has not lost yet. I recognized the effort because I had made it myself in rooms not entirely unlike this one. And I knew how much it cost, and how little it was worth when the information in the room was already complete. "Garrett," I said, "the accounts are frozen. The charter flight was canceled. The equity in Ryan's equipment has a protective order on it. The FBI has 412 pages of documentation and a formal evidence package that includes the Apex Holdings structure, the management consulting fee scheme, the offshore transfer connected to Harlan Cross, and a physician attestation from a doctor whose license has a disciplinary notation that your attorney filed on his behalf this morning." He looked up. "Your inside man identified himself when he forwarded my test information to your inbox in 4 hours and 17 minutes, I said. "We confirmed Marcus Webb was your source. That confirmation is also in the evidence package." Garrett said nothing. "Catherine Marsh's office has been processing the formal case since last night." I continued. "Agent Marsh is a thorough person. She works quickly." A long silence. Then Garrett said quietly, "What is it you want, Earl?" I looked at him. At the expensive suit and the controlled hands, and the face of a man who had spent 3 years treating me like a problem that solved itself, like an inconvenience that age and irrelevance would eventually remove. "I want my son," I said. "I want the 3 years back that you took from him while you were building a cage around his practice and his name. I want the $240,000 you took from the work of his hands. I want the life you were planning to let him take the consequences for when you got on that plane." I leaned forward slightly. "I can't have any of those things," I said. "So I'll take the next best thing." The door opened. Catherine Marsh came in first, which I had asked her to do. Not because the situation required it, but because I wanted Garrett to understand specifically who had been on the other side of the information I had delivered to her office. She was followed by 2 agents whose names I did not know and did not need to know. Garrett looked at her. He looked at the agents. He looked back at me. "Garrett Cole," Catherine said. Her voice was the voice of a person for whom this moment was professional rather than personal, which is the correct voice for this moment and why I had trusted her with it. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud." Garrett stood slowly. Not quickly, not with resistance. The stand of a man who has run his calculations and found that the available options have been reduced to one. One of the agents moved forward with handcuffs. Garrett looked at me across the table as the cuffs were applied. His expression was not rage, which surprised me slightly. It was the expression I had seen on the faces of other men in other rooms when the game ended. The particular blankness of a person whose next move is unknown to them, for the first time in a very long time. "The parking lot," he said. "That first day." "Yes," I said. "You let me push you." "Yes." He looked at me for another moment. Then he looked away. Catherine and the agents moved him toward the door. At the threshold, without turning around,
He said one more thing. I never thought you were enough, he said. I know, I said. That was your mistake. The door closed. I sat at the far end of the table alone for a moment, looking at the north windows and the dark shape of the Cumberland River beyond them, and the lights of the city reflected on the water, ordinary and indifferent to everything that had just happened in this room. Then I picked up my phone and called Walt. Tell Ryan it's done, I said. Walt drove Ryan to the farm after I called. I got there 20 minutes before they did. Enough time to make coffee and sit at the kitchen table in the quiet that follows the end of something. It was a specific kind of quiet. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of space. The way a room feels when something that has been filling it for a long time is finally gone, and the room is learning its own dimensions again. Ryan came in at 8:40, still wearing the jacket he had put on that morning. Walt nodded to me from the door and left without coming in, which was the right call. Walt understood the difference between the kind of moment that requires witnesses and the kind that does not. Ryan sat across from me. I poured his coffee without asking, the way I always had, the way I always would. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Is it done? He asked. It's done, I said. He nodded once. Then he was quiet for a while, which was all right. I had learned, raising Ryan, that he processed things at his own pace, and that trying to accelerate the pace produced less honesty, not more. So I drank my coffee and let the kitchen be quiet, and waited for him to arrive at whatever he needed to say. Outside, the November dark was complete. No moon visible through the kitchen window, just the tree line against a sky that had finally decided to be clear. The kind of cold clear that comes to Tennessee in November and makes the stars sharp and specific. Dad, he said finally. I waited. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of a man asking a genuine question that he has been carrying for several hours and needs the genuine answer to. Why didn't you tell me? What you did. What you were. I thought about all the versions of this answer I had rehearsed over the years, in the early mornings when I sat with coffee, and thought about the decisions I had made, and what they had cost, and whether the costs had been worth it. I had a dozen versions, some of them eloquent, some of them practical, some of them honest, only in the way that partial truth is honest, which is not fully. I chose the complete version. Because I was afraid, I said. Ryan looked at me. Not afraid of Garrett, I said. Not afraid of anything external. Afraid of what you would think of me if you knew. Not the work itself, but what the work required. The decisions, the things I had to be comfortable with that most people are not comfortable with. I was afraid you would look at me differently, that you would love the work instead of the man, or that you would be afraid of the man because of the work. Ryan was quiet. Your mother knew, I said. She knew from the beginning, and she never looked at me differently. But I always thought that was Eleanor, that she had a particular capacity for accepting complexity that most people don't. I was not sure you had inherited it. I was not sure I deserved to find out. That was the part I had not said to anyone. Not to Pete, not to Eleanor in her last months, not to myself, clearly until I read her letter in the locked room. The fear was not entirely about protecting Ryan. It was about protecting myself from the judgment of the person whose judgment mattered most. Ryan looked at the table. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. I would have understood, he said quietly. I think I would have understood a long time ago. I know that now, I said. He looked up. Do you? Yes, I said. I know it because of what you did this week. The way you listened. The way you acted when you knew what needed to be done. You handled it the way someone handles something when they have the capacity for it, not the way someone handles something that is too much for them. I should have known you had that capacity. I should have trusted it earlier. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he said I should have pushed harder. When I noticed the numbers were wrong, when I suspected something about Garrett. I let it go because I didn't know what to do with it. But I also let it go because it was easier not to know. I know, I said. We sat with that for a moment. Two people acknowledging their respective failures at the same table where those failures had been made, which seemed like the right place for it. Then Ryan said, "Did you ever think about telling me? Not the whole thing, just something." Many times, I said. Usually late at night. Usually when I had been thinking about your mother. He nodded. Eleanor's letter. He had seen it in the locked room earlier that week when I showed him the files. He had held it for a moment without reading it and set it carefully back in the envelope. She would have found this funny, he said, in that specific way she had of finding things funny when they were also painful. He almost smiled. The old intelligence colonel finally having to explain himself to his kid. She would have found it necessary, I said. There's a difference. Ryan looked at his coffee. Yeah, he said. There is. We were quiet again for a while. A different quality of quiet now. Not the heavy quiet of unsaid things, but something lighter. The quiet of two people who have said what needed to be said and are sitting in the space after it. What happens now? Ryan asked. With the practice? With the FBI inquiry? Danny and Catherine Marsh's office are coordinating, I said. Beverly Cho's protective orders are in place. Your statement is on the record, and it's clean. The inquiry will continue for a while because these things always do, but Catherine told me last night that the primary subject is Garrett, not you. Your name will come off the inquiry list in time. And the money. The $240 that Garrett took. Uncertain, I said. Some of it may be recoverable through the asset freeze. Some of it may be gone. Beverly will fight for what she can get. Ryan nodded. He absorbed this the way he absorbed difficult information directly and without resistance, making room for it in his understanding of how things were. Bad, he said after a moment. I waited. I knew you could handle it. He said it quietly, looking at the table. Not Garrett specifically. I didn't know about any of that. But I always knew there was something more to you than you were showing me, some room I wasn't allowed into. He looked up. I just didn't know what it contained. I looked at my son across the kitchen table. 31 years old, his mother's eyes, and my patience sitting in the kitchen where I had raised him, telling me that the wall I had built with such careful deliberateness had been visible all along. Not what was behind it, but the fact of its existence. Eleanor had been right. She had been right about everything that mattered. The room you weren't allowed into, I said, is open now. Ryan looked at me for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done since he was perhaps 14 years old. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine briefly, the way men do when the words available are not sufficient for the thing they are trying to say, and the gesture has to carry what the words cannot. Then he sat back and picked up his coffee. Okay, he said. He said it the way he had said it that morning, with all the weight that one word could carry. Okay. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 3 weeks passed. The way time passes after something significant has ended. Not quickly and not slowly, but with a different quality than the time before. The way the air in a room changes after you open a window that has been closed for years. Something is moving that was not moving before. The room is the same room, but it breathes differently. Garrett Cole was in federal custody in Nashville, held without bail pending a preliminary hearing on the wire fraud and money laundering charges. Harlan Cross had been taken into custody 8 days after Garrett, in a coordinated action that Catherine Marsh described as, in her careful professional language, significantly facilitated by the evidence package our group had provided. The Apex Holdings structure had been formally identified as a criminal enterprise. Beverly Cho had recovered $163,000 of the $240,000 taken from Ryan's practice through the asset freeze. The remainder, Beverly said, would be a longer process. But she was patient, and she was good at longer processes. Ryan's name had been formally removed from the FBI inquiry list on a Wednesday afternoon. Danny had called to tell me. I had written the date in the margin of a legal pad, and then sat at the kitchen table for a while, without doing anything else. Because sometimes, the right response to the end of something is to let it be ended before moving to what comes next. What came next was a Saturday in December. Ryan's truck appeared at the end of the gravel road at noon, which was when I had told him to come, and I had been ready since 10 because that is the kind of man I am. And at 71, I had stopped apologizing for it. The fields were white. We had gotten 4 inches of snow the previous night, the first significant snow of the season, and it had done what Tennessee snow does when it arrives cleanly and without ice, which is make the familiar landscape into something that looks like it is seeing itself for the first time. I was on the porch when he pulled in. He got out and stood for a moment looking at the farm, the way he sometimes did the way people look at a place they grew up in when they have been away from it long enough to see it instead of just inhabiting it. Then he walked to the porch, and we did what we always did, which required no words and had required no words for 30 years. I opened the door, and he came in, and I went to the kitchen. I had made the things that needed to be made. Beef stew in the Dutch oven, the recipe Eleanor had taught me in the first year of our marriage. Cornbread, because some things do not require reconsidering. An apple pie cooling on the counter from the apples I had put up in September from the tree Eleanor planted the spring before she got sick, which had been producing for 22 years and showed no signs of stopping. Ryan sat at the table and looked at the pie. "Mom's apples," he said. "Mom's apples," I said. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of someone receiving something they had not expected to need as much as they needed it. Then he said simply, "Thank you, Dad." We ate without hurrying. The stew was what it was supposed to be, which meant it was Eleanor's recipe correctly executed, which was the highest standard I applied to that particular dish. Ryan ate the way he always ate, which was to say without complaint, and with genuine attention. And we talked about his practice and the patients he was treating, and the staff member who had given notice, and the one he was considering hiring to replace her. Normal things. The ordinary conversation of a father and son who have found their way back to each other and are learning again how to inhabit the ordinary together. After lunch, I said, "There's something I want to show you." He followed me down the hall to the locked room. I had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, since the night he sat at the kitchen table and told me he had always known the room existed and had always wondered what it contained. I had thought about whether to open it and what opening it would mean, and whether the meaning was one I was ready for. I had decided that ready was not the relevant question. The relevant question was whether it was time. And it was time. I unlocked the door and pushed it open and turned on the lamp. Ryan stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the filing cabinets and the shelves and the hard drives in their cases and the gray metal box and the desk with its lamp throwing its small circle of light across 30 years of a life he had not been allowed to see. He came in slowly. He looked at the filing cabinets with their black marker labels, the years running from the earliest to the most recent. He looked at the shelves at the binders and the cases and the things that represented the shape of work he was only beginning to understand. He picked up one of the presentation cases from the gray metal box, looked at what was inside, and set it carefully back. Then he looked at the photograph I had kept on the desk. A photograph I had not mentioned to him, not in the conversations of the past 3 weeks, not in the briefings about Garrett and Apex and the evidence package. A photograph of his mother and me, taken in the 2nd year of our marriage, in a kitchen that was not this kitchen, but that had the same quality of light in it, the same sense of a life being built deliberately and with care. He picked it up. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set it back on the desk in the same position it had always been, and he turned to me with an expression that contained everything he did not need to say and that I did not need to hear said. "I understand," he said. Not the work. I'll learn the work. But I understand why you kept it, why you needed to keep it. I nodded. He looked around the room one more time. Then he looked at me. Can I come back? He asked. And look at more of it? When there's time. There's always time, I said. It's your room too now. He nodded, once the single nod of a man accepting something he has been waiting to accept. Then he turned and walked back down the hall toward the kitchen, toward the pie, and the afternoon, and the ordinary life of a December Saturday on a farm in Tennessee. I turned off the lamp. The room went dark. But it was a different dark now. Not the dark of a sealed space, not the dark of something hidden. Just the regular dark of a room between one use and the next, waiting with the patience of rooms that have always had something worth waiting for. I locked the door out of habit. Then I thought about that the habit of locking the 30 years of keeping this particular space closed against the people I loved most. I looked at the key in my hand for a moment. Then I put it back in my pocket. Some habits take time to unlearn. That was all right. There was time now. I walked back to the kitchen where my son was cutting pie, and I sat down at the table, and outside the windows, the December snow was bright on the 40 acres that had been mine for 26 years and would be his someday. And the apple tree Eleanor planted was bare against the white sky, and the afternoon was quiet in all the right ways. I want to say something to you if you have been listening to this story. Not about Garrett Cole. Not about what he did or what happened to him. That part resolved itself the way those parts do, through institutions and courts and the slow machinery of consequences that catches up, eventually, to people who believe they are exempt from it. What I want to say is about the room. I kept that room locked for 30 years because I believed that the people I loved could not handle what it contained. I was wrong about that. But I was wrong in a specific way that I think is worth naming, because I suspect it is not uncommon. I did not lock the room because I thought Ryan was weak. I locked it because I was afraid that what it revealed about me was too much, too complicated, too far from the simple father I wanted to be for him. I locked it because being known completely is the most frightening thing there is, and I had spent 30 years being known partially, and partial knowing felt safer. What I learned is that partial knowing is not safety. It is distance. And distance, when applied to the people who matter most, is its own kind of damage. Slower than the damage Garrett Cole did, but no less real. The people who love you can handle who you are. They have been waiting to. If there is something you have kept in a locked room from your son, from your brother, from the people whose judgment you fear most, because you care most about it, consider this. The cost of the lock is not just yours to pay. And the key has been in your pocket the whole time. If this story reached something in you, I would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need it. There are men out there sitting on porches with locked rooms behind them, and sometimes all they need is to hear that the opening is worth the cost. Leave a comment if you are one of them, or if you know one. I read every one. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. Earl Maddox waited 30 years to open that locked door. Some doors take courage, not keys. If this story touched your heart, share it, and remember, vengeance belongs to the Lord, not to us. Romans 12:19.